where the quiet places of the world have a way of telling the most patient stories. Imagine, for a moment, that you're standing at the edge of something, not a cliff or a shoreline, but a wall of green so thick and so tall that the sky above you is not really sky anymore. It is just light, filtered down through 3 separate layers of canopy until it reaches you as something dim and greenish and diffuse, like light at the bottom of a lake. The air around you is warm and completely still. It smells like wet soil and something older than soil. You take a step forward, and the ground gives slightly under your boot, soft and uncertain, as though the earth itself has not quite decided what it wants to be. You take another step, the forest closes behind you, and somewhere ahead, in a direction that your compass can confirm but your instincts cannot quite trust, there are roughly 83,000 square kilometers of this. That is La Mosquitia. It stretches across the eastern portion of Honduras and spills into northeastern Nicaragua, a region sometimes called the Mosquito Coast, which is one of those place names that sounds almost quaint until you understand what it means to be inside it. 83,000 square kilometers. To put that in some kind of human scale, that is larger than the entire country of Panama. It is larger than Portugal, and yet, in the 21st century, with satellites and LIDAR and GPS coordinates precise enough to locate a single tree, large stretches of La Mosquitia's interior remain genuinely unmapped at ground level, not poorly mapped, not approximately mapped, genuinely unmapped, in the sense that no person with instruments has walked through them and recorded what is there. There are no roads connecting the interior of La Mosquitia to the rest of Honduras. That is not a figure of speech or a mild exaggeration. There are simply no roads. The Honduran highway network ends well to the west of the region's core. From there you're looking at rivers, footpaths and small aircraft, landing on strips of cleared grass that may or may not be usable, depending on how much it has rained in the past 48 hours. The forest itself is what ecologists call a triple canopy rainforest. The tallest trees reach 40 or 50 meters. Below them, a second layer of mid-canopy trees fills in most of the remaining light. Below that, a third layer of smaller trees and palms catches whatever is left. By the time you're standing on the forest floor, you're living in a world that receives perhaps 2 or 3% of the sunlight falling on the canopy above you. The humidity in the interior regularly approaches 100%. Breathing feels slightly effortful, not because the air lacks oxygen, but because it is so saturated with moisture that your lungs seem to be working against a small but constant resistance. Some expedition members have described it as breathing through a warm, wet cloth that someone is pressing gently against your face. That description is not dramatic, it is just accurate. The rivers flood without warning. Rainfall in some parts of the region exceeds 2,800 millimeters per year, and that is the annual average, not an extreme event. During the wet season, which runs roughly from May through November, the rivers rise quickly and dramatically. A river that was crossable at knee height in the morning may be chest deep and fast moving by afternoon. The forest floor in the lowland sections can remain underwater for months at a time. There are places in La Mosquitia's interior where the concept of a stable, walkable surface is simply not applicable for large portions of the year. Before we go any further into this, and there is a great deal further to go, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are listening? Is it late? The kind of late where the house is quiet and the rest of the world feels like it has stepped back for a few hours? Or are you somewhere else entirely, on a commute, or sitting outside, or maybe somewhere warm with the window open? I ask because La Mosquitia is the kind of place that feels very far from wherever you are, and I think that distance is part of what makes it worth sitting with for a while. A place this remote, this genuinely resistant to human presence, is rare in a way that deserves some attention. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of slow, careful storytelling about places and histories that don't often get the time they deserve, it would mean a great deal if you pressed the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might expect, and it keeps these long, unhurried explorations going. Now, Back to the forest. What makes La Mosquitia different from other remote places is not simply that it is large or wet or difficult. Many places are those things. What makes it genuinely unusual, historically, practically, and in a way that has frustrated explorers, researchers, and governments for several centuries, is the combination of factors that all compound each other simultaneously. The terrain is unstable, the climate is hostile, the biological environment is actively dangerous in documented specific ways, the infrastructure does not exist, and even the political and human geography of the region adds layers of complexity that do not exist in, say, a remote stretch of the Siberian taiga or the Australian outback. People have been trying to cross La Mosquitia for a very long time. Spanish colonial expeditions attempted it in the 16th and 17th centuries, and they largely failed or turned back. British traders and surveyors mapped the coast but rarely the interior. 20th century adventurers and archaeologists reached the rivers and stopped. Modern expeditions equipped with GPS, satellite phones and helicopter support have penetrated the interior for days or weeks, and then been extracted before they could go further. There is a pattern here that is worth noticing. It is not that the region has never been attempted. It is that the attempts keep ending in the same place, at the edge of the deep interior, where the forest simply becomes too much. The question that organises everything we're going to talk about tonight is not simply why La Mosquitia is hard to reach. Hard to reach is a description that applies to plenty of places. The real question is why, after centuries of attempts by increasingly well-equipped and determined people, the region is still essentially uncrossed. Why does a full traverse of the interior, entering from the Western Highlands and walking through to the Caribbean coast, roughly 250 kilometres through the core, remain something that no modern expedition has documented completing? What is it about this specific combination of geography, biology, history and human complexity that has kept La Mosquitia in a category that almost no other place on Earth still occupies? That is what we're going to explore tonight, carefully and without rushing. And I want to be clear about something from the beginning. La Mosquitia has attracted a certain amount of sensationalized attention over the years, particularly around legends of lost cities and hidden civilizations. Some of that attention is warranted. There are genuinely remarkable archaeological discoveries to discuss, and we will discuss them in detail. But the region's resistance to human crossing is not primarily a mystery in the romantic sense. It is not about curses or supernatural forces or the unknowable. It is about specific, measurable, documented physical realities that stack on top of each other in ways that overwhelm the human body and human logistics. The forest does not care about human plans. That is not a metaphor, or rather it is a metaphor, but it is also just true. The trees do not move aside. The rivers do not slow down. The insects do not make exceptions. The mud does not firm up because someone needs it to. La Mosquitia operates entirely on its own terms, and the history of human encounters with it is largely a history of people discovering, sometimes painfully, that those terms are not negotiable. So let us start at the beginning, with the land itself. Because before you can understand why expeditions fail, or why legends persist, or why the archaeology is so difficult, or why conservation and danger and indigenous sovereignty all become tangled together in this one region, before any of that, you have to understand what the ground actually feels like, what the air actually does to your body, and what the rivers actually mean when they decide to rise. La Mosquitia occupies the eastern lowlands of Honduras and a portion of northeastern Nicaragua. The region is bounded roughly by the Caribbean coast to the north and east, the Honduran interior highlands to the west, and the Nicaraguan border to the south. Within those boundaries, the landscape is not uniform. It shifts from highland forest in the west to flooded lowland savanna and swamp near the coast, with river corridors cutting through everything. But the core of the region, the deep interior that nobody reaches, is primary rainforest on terrain that offers almost no stable footing, no clear lines of travel, and no margin for error. The name Mosquito Coast, or Mosquitia, does not actually come from the insect. though the insects are very much present and very much relevant to what happens to human bodies in the region. The name comes from the Mosquito people, the indigenous group whose territory has centred on this coastline for centuries. We will come back to the Mosquito in some detail later, because their history in this region is essential to understanding why the land is the way it is, and why outside attempts to enter it have so consistently struggled. But for now, the name is simply a geographical anchor. The region's size, those 83,000 square kilometres, becomes more meaningful when you try to move through it, rather than simply measure it from above. A satellite image of La Mosquitia looks like a continuous green surface, broken by the silver threads of rivers. From the air it looks passable, it looks like forest, and humans have been moving through forests for a very long time. But that visual impression is exactly the kind of thing the region punishes you for trusting. The canopy you see from above is hiding terrain that has no consistent relationship to what the satellite suggests. Flat-looking areas are often flooded. What appears to be a navigable river corridor from altitude may be a braided, shifting channel system that changes its shape from week to week. The green is real. The implied accessibility is not. There is something worth sitting with here before we move forward. We are living in an era when the surface of Mars has been mapped in higher resolution than parts of La Mosquitia's interior have been mapped at ground level. That is not an exaggeration. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has produced topographic data for the Martian surface at resolutions that exceed what we have for certain sections of this Honduran rainforest, simply because Mars does not have a triple canopy blocking every signal, and because nobody is trying to build a road to Olympus Mons. La Mosquitia is, in a very specific sense, a place that the modern world has been unable to fully see. And that invisibility, that genuine, documented, measurable gap in human knowledge of a place that exists on the same planet as everything else, is where this story really begins. Because once you understand that the land itself resists being known, the next question becomes obvious. What is the land actually like, in physical terms, in the specific ways that matter to a human body trying to move through it? What are the rivers doing? What is living in the forest? And what does the terrain do to the people who try to enter it, even with every modern advantage available? Those are the questions we're going to take up next. The Rio Platano Biosphere Reserve was formally established in 1980, and 2 years later, in 1982, UNESCO designated it a World Heritage Site. On paper, those designations give the region a kind of official weight, a recognition that what exists here is significant enough to protect. The reserve covers approximately 8,150 square kilometres, which is already a number that's hard to hold in your mind. For context, that is roughly the size of Puerto Rico, and the Rio Platano Reserve is only one portion of the larger La Mosquitia region. It sits within it like a protected core inside something even larger and less defined. The reserve takes its name from the Rio Platano, one of several major river systems that drain the interior highlands toward the Caribbean. The Platano runs roughly northeast through the heart of the reserve, and in the dry season, to the extent that there is a dry season here, it is navigable by small boat for portions of its length. That word navigable is doing a lot of work, though. It means possible under certain conditions, with the right kind of vessel, by people who know the river. It does not mean easy or predictable or safe. The river systems of La Mosquitia are one of the defining physical facts of the region, and they are worth understanding in some detail because they shape everything else. The forest, the wildlife, the archaeology, the history of human movement, all of it. The major rivers are the Platano, the Patuca, the Coco, and the Paulaya, along with dozens of smaller tributaries and seasonal channels. These rivers do not behave the way rivers in more temperate climates tend to behave. They are not stable corridors with consistent banks and predictable flow. They braid, they shift. During the rainy season, which runs roughly from May through January in the wettest parts of the region, the rivers do not simply rise. They expand sideways, spreading across the floodplain and turning vast areas of forest floor into shallow, murky water. A path that was dry ground in March may be knee-deep in river water by June. and that water does not stay in one place. It moves, it carries debris, it hides what is underneath it. Annual rainfall in the wettest zones of La Mosquitia exceeds 2,800 millimeters. Some areas receive closer to 3,500 millimeters in a particularly heavy year. To put that in terms that are easier to feel, London receives about 600 millimeters of rain per year. New York gets roughly 1,200. The wettest parts of the Pacific Northwest in the United States, which are considered extremely rainy by North American standards, receive around 3,000 millimeters in exceptional years. La Mosquitia routinely exceeds what most people would consider a very wet place, and the rain does not fall evenly across the year. It comes in sustained heavy periods that saturate the forest floor completely. The soil, which is clay-heavy and sits on a relatively flat lowland basin in much of the interior, does not drain quickly. It holds water. The forest floor stays wet not just during rain events, but for weeks afterward, and in the lowest lying areas, it may not fully dry out for months at a time. What this means practically for anyone trying to move through the region on foot is that the ground itself is unreliable. You cannot assume that what looks like solid earth will hold your weight. You cannot assume that a route that was passable last week is still passable today. Expedition members who have entered the region describe moving through sections where every step has to be tested before committing your weight, where you sink to your ankle or your knee without warning, where fallen trees that look solid enough to cross crumble when you put your foot on them because they have been rotting in standing water for years. Progress is measured not in kilometers per hour but in meters per hour. On a good day, in reasonable conditions, a well-equipped team might cover 3 to 4 kilometers. On a difficult day, through flooded lowland with dense undergrowth, that number can drop below 1. The forest itself adds another layer of physical resistance that is separate from the flooding. La Mosquitia's interior is primary rainforest, not secondary growth, not forest that has been cleared and regrown, but original, unbroken canopy that in some areas has not been significantly disturbed for centuries. Primary rainforest has a specific character that is worth describing. The canopy is triple layered, meaning there are tall emergent trees reaching 40 or 50 meters above the ground, a mid-level canopy below that, and a lower understory layer beneath that. The result is that almost no direct sunlight reaches the forest floor. The light that does filter through is dim and diffuse, a kind of permanent green twilight. This affects everything. It means navigation by sun position is nearly impossible. It means that the forest floor, while not as densely vegetated as a clearing or secondary growth area, is covered in roots, fallen logs, mosses, and low plants that all compete for the limited light and all create obstacles for anyone moving through them. The humidity inside this forest is something that people who've been there describe in almost physical terms. The air is not just warm and humid in the way that a hot summer day can feel humid, it is saturated. Breathing feels like breathing through a warm, wet cloth, and that is not a dramatic comparison. It is a phrase that appears in expedition accounts from multiple different researchers who entered the region at different times. Sweat does not evaporate. Clothing stays wet. Skin stays wet. Nothing dries. Equipment that is not carefully protected begins to fail. Leather softens and rots. Electronics corrode. Paper dissolves. The human body, which regulates its temperature partly through evaporative cooling, struggles in an environment where evaporation barely happens. Heat exhaustion is a real risk even at temperatures that would not be dangerous in drier conditions. South and west of the Rio Platano Reserve, across the border into Nicaragua, the Bosawas Biosphere Reserve extends the protected forest zone further. Bosawas, established in 1997, covers approximately 20,000 square kilometers and is the largest tropical rainforest reserve in Central America. Together, the Rio Platano Reserve and Bosawas form part of the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor, a chain of protected areas stretching from Mexico to Panama. The Tahuaca-Sangni Biosphere Reserve, established in Honduras in 1999, sits between the Platano Reserve and the Nicaraguan border. covering roughly 2,300 square kilometers along the middle Patuca River. These protected designations are significant and worth acknowledging, but they are also in some ways administrative lines drawn on a map that the forest does not recognize. The trees do not know they are in a biosphere reserve. The rivers do not stop flooding because a boundary has been declared. The practical effect of these designations on the ground conditions of the region is limited. What the designations do tell us is that the region has been formally recognized as exceptional, as a place of global ecological significance that deserves protection. And the reason it deserves protection is directly connected to the reason it is so difficult to cross. The same conditions that make La Mosquitia hostile to human movement have also made it a refuge for biodiversity that has been lost almost everywhere else in Central America. The forest has remained intact because people cannot easily get into it. The species have survived because the terrain that would be required to exploit them commercially is essentially impassable. The inaccessibility and the ecological richness are not separate facts. They are the same fact seen from two different angles. But let us stay with the physical geography for a moment longer, because there is one more element that does not get enough attention in most accounts of the region, and it matters considerably. The terrain of La Mosquitia is not uniform from west to east. The western portion of the region, where the interior highlands begin to slope down toward the lowlands, is relatively higher ground. Forested hills and ridges that are difficult to move through, but at least offer solid footing. As you move east toward the Caribbean coast, the elevation drops and the landscape transitions into something closer to a flooded plain. The rivers widen and slow. The forest gives way in places to flooded savannas, wetlands, and eventually mangrove swamps along the coast itself. A true crossing of La Mosquitia from west to east would require navigating all of these zones in sequence: the highland forest, the flooded interior lowland, the swampy coastal plain, and the mangrove delta. Each zone has its own specific set of obstacles. None of them is easy, and they do not transition gently into one another. The changes in terrain are abrupt enough that a team that has developed a rhythm and a strategy for one type of ground may find that strategy completely useless when the landscape shifts. There is also the question of what the rivers do during a crossing. The major river systems run roughly from west to east, which means that anyone attempting to cross La Mosquitia from the Western Highlands to the Caribbean coast is not travelling along the rivers, but across them. A crossing would require fording, or otherwise crossing the Patuca, the Platano, the Paulaya, and numerous smaller tributaries. During the dry season, some of these crossings might be manageable with the right equipment and the right timing. During the rainy season, they are not manageable. The rivers run fast, deep and wide. The banks are unstable. The water carries debris, logs, branches, material swept up from the flooded forest floor. A river crossing that goes wrong in La Mosquitia is not a situation you recover from easily, and the nearest place where you might receive serious medical attention is hours away by helicopter, assuming a helicopter can reach you at all through the cloud cover that frequently sits over the interior. All of this, the rainfall, the flooding, the unstable ground, the humidity, the triple canopy, the river crossings, adds up to something that is worth naming directly. La Mosquitia does not have a single dramatic obstacle. It does not have one enormous mountain, or one impassable cliff, or one specific feature that blocks human movement. What it has is an accumulation of moderate to severe obstacles that are present simultaneously, continuously, and without relief. You cannot wait out the flooding, because by the time the flooding recedes, the rainy season has started again. You cannot avoid the humidity, because it is not a weather event. It is the permanent condition of the environment. You cannot find higher ground that is also navigable, because the higher ground is its own kind of difficult. The obstacles layer on top of each other in a way that compounds their individual effects. Fatigue, wetness, slow progress, heat stress, unreliable footing. Each one of these things is manageable in isolation. Together, sustained over days and weeks, They overwhelm the human body's capacity to keep functioning at the level that forward movement requires. This is what expedition members mean when they describe La Mosquitia as something other than simply difficult. It is not that any single moment is impossible to survive. It is that the environment demands a constant, unrelenting expenditure of physical and mental energy that most human bodies cannot sustain indefinitely, and that the consequences of a bad moment, a twisted ankle, a failed river crossing, a navigation error, a sudden illness, are far more serious here than they would be almost anywhere else, because the margin between a manageable problem and a life-threatening one is very thin when you're days from any kind of outside help. The land itself has no stable surface to build on, and very little stable surface to move across. That is not a poetic observation. It is a geological and hydrological fact with direct consequences for everything that has ever been attempted in the region. And it raises a question that the geography alone cannot answer. Because if the land is this difficult, if it is this consistently, specifically hostile to human movement, then what is living inside it? What has survived in the spaces that human movement cannot reach? That is where this story goes next. The question of what lives inside La Mosquitia is not a small one, and the answer, when you start to look at it carefully, goes some way toward explaining why the region has defeated so many attempts to move through it. Not just because of the terrain, but because of what the terrain contains. Let us start with something that sounds almost mundane until you hear the details. Botflies, specifically the human botfly Dermatobia hominis, which is present throughout the lowland tropical forests of Central America, and particularly well established in the humid, warm, densely vegetated environment of La Mosquitia. The botfly does not bite you directly. Instead, it catches a mosquito or another biting insect in flight, attaches its eggs to that insect's body, and then when the insect lands on human skin, the warmth triggers the eggs to hatch. The larvae burrow into the skin and begin to feed on subcutaneous tissue. They breathe through a small hole they keep open at the surface. They can stay there for weeks. You know they are there because you can feel them moving. Several members of documented expeditions into the region have returned with botfly infestations, and the treatment, which involves either suffocating the larva by covering the breathing hole and then extracting it, or waiting for it to mature and emerge on its own, is not something most people want to experience after an already grueling time in the field. It is not life-threatening in most cases, but it is a specific, concrete illustration of the kind of biological pressure the environment applies to anyone who enters it. The forest is not simply difficult to walk through, it is actively interested in your body as a resource. More serious and more consequential for expedition planning is leishmaniasis. This is a parasitic disease transmitted by the bite of infected sandflies, tiny insects, barely visible, that are abundant in the humid forest understory. The cutaneous form of the disease causes skin ulcers, typically on exposed areas like the face, arms, and legs. The ulcers are not immediately painful, which is part of what makes them insidious. They can develop slowly, and by the time a person realizes something is wrong, the infection may already be well established. Treatment requires antiparasitic drugs, and in some cases the treatment itself is difficult to tolerate. The disease is endemic in La Mosquitia. Researchers who have entered the region, even briefly and with protective clothing, have contracted it. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented, recurring consequence of spending time in this particular environment. The 2015 ground expedition, which we will come back to in more detail later, is perhaps the most widely reported example of this. The team that entered the T1 site in February of that year included professional archaeologists, journalists, filmmakers, and Honduran Special Forces personnel. They were equipped with insect repellent, protective clothing, and awareness of the risks. They were on the ground for approximately 9 days. After returning, nearly all of them were diagnosed with cutaneous leishmaniasis. Some required months of treatment. Douglas Preston, the journalist who wrote about the expedition extensively, described the experience of learning the diagnosis and then going through the treatment process in considerable detail. The point is not that the team was careless. The point is that 9 days in La Mosquitia, even with modern equipment and medical awareness, was enough to infect an entire well-prepared group with a parasitic disease that required prolonged medical intervention. A crossing of the full interior would take 30 to 40 days at minimum. The exposure risk over that kind of duration is not something that can be fully mitigated. Then there are the snakes. La Mosquitia has several species of venomous snakes, but 2 in particular are worth understanding in some detail, because they are not background hazards. They are significant, well-documented threats that change how you have to move through the forest. The fer de lance, known scientifically as Bothrops asper, is considered one of the most medically significant snakes in the entire Western Hemisphere. It is responsible for a large proportion of snakebite fatalities in Central America. It is large. Adults commonly reach 150 to 180 centimeters, and some individuals exceed 2 meters. It is not especially shy. It tends to rest in leaf litter, at the base of trees, along riverbanks, and in exactly the kind of ground-level vegetation that a person moving through dense forest is constantly pushing through or stepping over. The fer de lance is also capable of striking quickly and at a relatively long range. Its venom is hemotoxic. It disrupts the blood's ability to clot, causes tissue destruction, and can lead to organ failure if not treated promptly. Anti-venom exists, but it must be administered in a medical facility, and it must be administered reasonably soon after the bite. In La Mosquitia, where the nearest trauma hospital is in Tegucigalpa or San Pedro Sula, both hours away even by helicopter, assuming a helicopter can reach you through the weather. A fer de lance bite is a medical emergency with a very narrow window for a good outcome. The bushmaster, Lachesis muta, is the longest venomous snake in the Americas, reaching up to 3 meters in some individuals. It is less common than the fer de lance but present in the region. It is a nocturnal ambush predator, which means it is most active during the hours when a team in the field is trying to rest. Its venom is also hemotoxic, and its size means it can deliver a large volume of venom in a single strike. There is something about the bushmaster that tends to get into the minds of people planning expeditions into this kind of terrain, not because it is the most likely threat, but because it represents the upper end of what the environment can produce. A 3-meter venomous snake, moving silently at night through the undergrowth of a forest you cannot see clearly, is not a comfortable thing to know is out there. The practical consequence of the snake situation in La Mosquitia is not that people are constantly being bitten. Most experienced guides and researchers who enter the region do not get bitten because they move carefully, use appropriate footwear, and pay attention. The consequence is the evacuation problem. Any serious medical emergency, snakebite, severe infection, injury from a fall, a bad case of malaria, requires helicopter evacuation. And helicopter evacuation in La Mosquitia is not reliable. The cloud cover over the interior is dense and frequent. The forest canopy leaves almost no natural clearings large enough for a helicopter to land. Even the small clearings that exist may be flooded or obscured. In the 2015 expedition, the team was flown in by helicopter to a clearing that had been identified from aerial imagery. But the landing was described as difficult, and the clearing was barely adequate. Getting a medical evacuation helicopter into a specific location in the interior of La Mosquitia under emergency conditions in uncertain weather is a genuinely complicated operation. It is not impossible, but it is the kind of thing that requires everything to go right, and in an emergency, things often do not go right. Beyond the snakes and the parasites, there is the broader insect situation. Malaria is transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes, which are present throughout the region. The specific strains circulating in La Mosquitia include Plasmodium vivax, which causes recurring bouts of fever and is difficult to fully eliminate from the body, and in some areas Plasmodium falciparum, which is the more dangerous form and can progress to cerebral malaria if untreated. Dengue fever is also present, transmitted by Aedes mosquitoes, and causes severe joint pain, high fever, and in its hemorrhagic form can be life-threatening. Chikungunya, another mosquito-borne virus, causes debilitating joint pain that can persist for months after the initial infection. None of these diseases is unique to La Mosquitia. They are present across much of tropical Central America, but the density of mosquito populations in the humid lowland forest, combined with the difficulty of maintaining consistent protective measures over a long expedition and the distance from medical care, means that the risk profile is considerably higher than in most places where these diseases are also present. There is also something worth saying about the cumulative effect of all of this, because individual risks can sound manageable when listed one at a time. Botflies, leishmaniasis, venomous snakes, malaria, dengue. Each one of these is a documented hazard, but each one is also something that people deal with in tropical environments around the world. The difference in La Mosquitia is not that any single one of these things is uniquely lethal. The difference is that they are all present simultaneously, in a place where the terrain already demands enormous physical effort, where the heat and humidity are constant and draining, where navigation is difficult, where weather can change the entire situation within hours, and where the nearest serious medical facility is not a 20-minute drive away, but a helicopter flight that may or may not be possible, depending on conditions. A person who twists an ankle in La Mosquitia is in a much worse position than a person who twists an ankle in almost any other environment, not because the injury is different, but because the context around it is so unforgiving. A person who develops a fever in the interior of La Mosquitia cannot simply take a day off and rest in a comfortable place while they recover. They are already sleeping on wet ground in heat, surrounded by insects, eating food from supplies that are being depleted whether or not they are moving, and they cannot simply call for help and expect it to arrive quickly. The environment does not pause to accommodate human weakness. It continues doing what it does, and the person in difficulty has to manage that reality on top of whatever is already wrong with them. This is what expedition members and researchers mean when they describe the biological environment of La Mosquitia as actively hostile. It is not that the forest is malicious in any meaningful sense. It is that the combination of organisms, conditions and circumstances creates a situation where the human body is under constant biological pressure from multiple directions at once, and where the usual safety nets that modern people rely on, hospitals, pharmacies, emergency services, reliable communication, are either absent or extremely difficult to access. The forest does not care about the distinction between a manageable problem and a fatal one. That distinction is entirely up to the people inside it, and they have to make it correctly every day for the entire duration of their time there. What makes this worth dwelling on is that the biological dangers of La Mosquitia are not just obstacles for explorers or archaeologists. They are part of the reason the region has remained so intact. The same conditions that make it difficult for a research team to spend 30 days in the interior also make it difficult for loggers, ranchers, and others who might otherwise have moved into the forest and cleared it. The fer-de-lance and the sandfly and the botfly are not just hazards for the people trying to study the region. They are, in a functional sense, part of the forest's own defense system. Not by design. Biology does not work by design in that sense, but by effect. The biological hostility of the environment has contributed to keeping the human footprint in the interior very small, which has in turn contributed to keeping the ecosystem relatively intact. This is a strange thing to sit with. The diseases and venomous animals that have made La Mosquitia so difficult to enter are also, in a roundabout way, part of why it still exists in the condition it does. Remove those biological barriers, which you cannot do, but imagine it, and the region would be far more accessible, and far more accessible means far more vulnerable to the kind of land use change that has destroyed similar ecosystems across Central America. The danger is inseparable from the preservation. They come from the same source. All of that said, the biological environment of La Mosquitia has not stopped people from trying to enter it. It has not stopped them from coming back, sometimes more than once, despite knowing exactly what the conditions are. There is something in the region that keeps pulling people toward it, something beyond the difficulty, or perhaps because of the difficulty, or perhaps because of what the difficulty seems to be protecting. The people who have gone in, and the people who have tried and turned back, and the people who have spent years planning expeditions that never quite got off the ground. They were not drawn in by ignorance of what the forest contained. Most of them knew. They went anyway. And the question of why and what they were looking for takes us into a different kind of story entirely, one that is older than any modern expedition, and that begins not with science or logistics, but with rumour, legend, and the particular human compulsion to believe that somewhere in the places we cannot easily reach, something extraordinary is waiting. To understand who has actually lived within La Mosquitia, and why the region has not simply been empty of human beings all this time, you have to start with a basic correction to the way outsiders have often thought about it. The interior of the Mosquito Coast is not a blank. It never was. The people who have called this region home for thousands of years did not survive here by conquering the forest, or by forcing a path through it. They survived by understanding it in a way that most outsiders have never managed, and by building their lives around the logic of the land rather than against it. The Mosquito people are the most numerous of the indigenous groups associated with this coast. Their population today is estimated at somewhere between 150,000 and 180,000, spread across eastern Honduras and northeastern Nicaragua, and their name is the one that gave the entire coast its identity. The Mosquito Coast, La Mosquitia. These names come from them, not from the insects, though the insects are certainly present. The mosquito have lived along the rivers and lagoons of this region for a very long time, and what is striking about their relationship with the landscape is the way they have oriented themselves within it. The rivers that outside explorers and expedition teams have experienced as obstacles, unpredictable, braiding, flooding, shifting, the mosquito have always understood as roads, not metaphorically, literally. The river systems of the Mosquito Coast are the transportation network, the Rio Coco, the Rio Patuca, the Rio Platano. These are the routes along which people move, trade, communicate, and maintain connections between communities. You do not fight the river, you read it, and you travel with it. This is a different relationship with geography than the one most outside visitors bring with them. A researcher or an explorer arriving in La Mosquitia tends to think in terms of distance as the crow flies, a point A and a point B, and a need to get from one to the other as efficiently as possible. The mosquito way of moving through the region is not like that. It follows the water. It accepts that certain routes are only possible at certain times of year, that certain places are only reachable under certain conditions, and that the landscape itself sets the terms of travel rather than the traveller. This is not a limitation. It is a form of knowledge accumulated over generations that allows people to live successfully in an environment that defeats most outsiders within days. Further into the interior, away from the coastal lagoons and the lower river systems, the Pech people, sometimes called the Paya, have lived in the highland forest zones of the region for centuries. The Pech are a much smaller group, numbering only a few thousand today, and they occupy some of the more elevated and difficult terrain in the interior. Their territory overlaps with areas that outside expeditions have found nearly impassable, and their continued presence there is itself a kind of evidence about what it takes to actually live in this landscape, rather than simply pass through it. The Pech have their own oral traditions about the interior, their own knowledge of which plants are edible, which are medicinal, which are dangerous, and whether rivers can and cannot be crossed at different times of year. This knowledge is not written down in any form that outside researchers can easily access. It exists in the people themselves, in the practices and stories passed between generations. Along the Rio Patuca, in the deep interior, the Tawaka people, also known as the Sumu, maintain communities that have remained largely isolated from the outside world for most of their history. The Tawaka Asangni Biosphere Reserve, established in 1999, was created in part to protect their territory from encroachment, and it covers roughly 230,000 hectares of interior forest along the Patuca River system. The Tawaka number only around 2,000 people today, making them one of the smallest indigenous groups in Honduras, and their survival in one of the most difficult environments in the hemisphere is something that tends to get overlooked in the narratives about La Mosquitia as an unexplored or uninhabited wilderness. It is not uninhabited. It is home to people who have been there far longer than anyone writing about it from the outside. What the presence of these communities tells us about La Mosquitia is important, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. These are not people who have found a way to neutralise the dangers of the environment. The fer de lance is still there. The sandflies are still there. The flooding is still there. The heat and the humidity and the difficulty of movement are all still there. What the mosquito and the petch and the tawaka have is not immunity to these things. What they have is a deep, practical, inherited understanding of how to navigate a world that contains all of these things, how to recognise the signs of danger, how to manage risk, how to use the environment's own resources to address problems when they arise. The forest is not safe for them, but it is known to them in a way it has never been known to outside visitors. The colonial history of the Mosquito Coast reflects this reality in a very direct way. The Spanish, who colonised most of Central America with considerable efficiency and considerable violence, largely failed to pacify or control the Mosquito Coast. Their attempts to establish a permanent presence in the region were repeatedly frustrated, not by military resistance alone, though the Mosquito were formidable fighters, but by the land itself. The interior was simply too difficult to penetrate, too difficult to supply, too hostile to the kind of settled agricultural colonization that the Spanish were attempting to establish elsewhere. The Mosquito held the coast in part because the coast was theirs to hold in a way that made sense given the terrain. Beginning in the 1630s, the Mosquito began trading with British merchants and buccaneers who operated along the Caribbean coast, and this relationship became one of the defining features of the region's history for the next 2 centuries. The British were not interested in colonising the interior. They were interested in trade, in turtle shells, in hardwood, eventually in enslaved people taken in raids further inland. And the Mosquito were willing partners in this trade in a way that served their own interests, including access to firearms and manufactured goods that gave them military advantages over neighbouring groups. The relationship was transactional and often exploitative in complex directions, but it had a particular geographic logic. The British could operate along the coast and along the lower rivers, and the Mosquito could operate throughout the region, and neither needed to penetrate the deep interior to make the arrangement work. The result of this alliance was something unusual in the history of the Americas, a nominally recognised indigenous political entity, the Mosquito Kingdom, that maintained a kind of sovereignty along the coast for roughly 2 centuries, with British backing and Spanish frustration. The Mosquito Kingdom was never a formal state in any modern sense. It was a loose political arrangement centred on a succession of Mosquito kings who were recognised by the British, and who served as useful counterweights to Spanish expansion in the region. The arrangement persisted until 1860, when the Treaty of Managua transferred British recognition of the region to Nicaragua, and the Mosquito Kingdom was formally dissolved, though the Mosquito themselves continued to occupy their territory and resist outside control for decades afterward. What this history illustrates, in practical terms, is that the inaccessibility of La Mosquitia was not just a natural fact, it was also a strategic resource. The Mosquito understood that the difficulty of the interior protected them. It made them hard to reach, hard to subdue, hard to displace. The Spanish could not follow them into the forest. Later, Honduran and Nicaraguan national governments found it difficult to extend effective administrative control into the region. The land's hostility to outsiders was something that the people who lived within it could use to their advantage, and they did. They oriented their lives around the rivers and the coast, maintained their knowledge of the interior, and let the forest do part of the work of keeping outsiders at bay. This is a different way of thinking about the geography of La Mosquitia than the one that tends to appear in expedition narratives. The usual framing treats the region as a barrier, something to be crossed, penetrated, overcome. But from the perspective of the people who have lived there for generations, the forest is not a barrier. It is a home, and its difficulty is part of what makes it defensible. The mosquito and the tawaka and the petch did not need to cross La Mosquitia. They did not need to move through it from one side to the other in a straight line. They lived within it, on its own terms, using its own logic, and in doing so they preserved both their communities and, in a certain sense, the forest itself. There is something quietly important about this that tends to get lost in the more dramatic narratives about the region. The story of La Mosquitia, as it usually gets told, is a story about outsiders trying and failing to enter a mysterious place. It is a story about expeditions, about legends, about lost cities and dangerous terrain, and all of that is real. But underneath that story is a different one, older and less dramatic, about people who have been inside the region all along, not conquering it, not mapping it, not looking for what it contains, but simply living there, in a relationship with the land that most outsiders have never understood and have rarely tried to understand. The indigenous communities of La Mosquitia have their own knowledge of the interior that no satellite image or lidar scan can replicate. They know which rivers flood in which months. They know where the ground is stable enough to camp on and where it will be underwater by morning. They know where the fer-de-lance tends to shelter during the heat of the day and where the botfly is most active. This knowledge exists in a form that is not easily transferred to an outside researcher who arrives by helicopter for a 9-day expedition. It is embodied knowledge, knowledge that lives in practice and habit and accumulated experience, and it represents a form of understanding of La Mosquitia that is in many ways more complete and more useful than anything the modern scientific apparatus has produced. This is not to romanticize the situation. The communities of La Mosquitia face serious pressures, from encroachment, from poverty, from limited access to healthcare and education, from the same external forces that threaten the forest itself. Their relationship with the land is not a static or idealized thing. It is a living, complicated, often difficult relationship shaped by history and circumstance. But the fact of their presence and the depth of their knowledge is something that any honest account of the region has to reckon with. What the outsiders who have come to La Mosquitia over the past several centuries were mostly looking for, however, was not the living knowledge of the people who were already there. They were looking for something else entirely, something they had heard about in rumours and legends, something that seemed to promise a different kind of discovery, a different kind of significance. The indigenous communities of the region had their own stories about the interior, their own accounts of what lay in the deep forest beyond the rivers they travelled. And those stories, filtered through European imaginations and colonial desires, and the particular human hunger for lost worlds, became something that would drive expeditions, obsessions, and a great deal of dangerous behaviour for the better part of 5 centuries. What the outsiders were looking for had a name, or rather several names, and the most enduring of them was a city made of white stone somewhere in the interior, waiting to be found. The legend has many names and no single origin, which is part of what makes it so persistent. Some accounts call it Ciudad Blanca, the White City. Others refer to it as the place where the father of all humans lives, a phrase that appears in various forms in indigenous oral traditions, as recorded by outside researchers, though the exact meaning and context of that phrase has been interpreted and reinterpreted so many times that it is difficult to know what it originally meant. In English-language popular writing, it became the City of the Monkey God, a name that carries a particular kind of pulp adventure energy that probably says more about early 20th century American publishing than it does about anything that actually exists in the Honduran interior. The legend, in its various forms, describes a city of white stone somewhere deep in La Mosquitia, large, ancient and abandoned, hidden under the canopy, waiting. The earliest documented European reference to something like this comes from Hernán Cortés himself. In 1526, Cortés wrote a letter to King Charles I of Spain, his fifth letter from New Spain, in which he mentioned receiving reports of a great and wealthy province to the east, beyond the territories he had already conquered. He called it Huaytapalan, or sometimes Chucutaco, depending on the source, and described it as a place of great riches and large settlements. Cortés never went there himself. He was occupied with other things, and the reports were second-hand at best, passed along through interpreters and intermediaries and the inevitable distortions of translation. But the letter exists. The reference is real. And it planted a seed in the European imagination of the Americas that proved remarkably durable. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish documents occasionally mention rumours of a great city or a wealthy province somewhere in the interior of what is now Honduras. None of these accounts are detailed or reliable. They tend to be brief references, often in the context of explaining why a particular expedition was proposed or why a particular region had not yet been fully explored. The interior of La Mosquitia appears in these documents as a kind of placeholder for the unknown, a space where things might exist that had not yet been found. The Spanish were by this point well practiced in the art of finding things that had not been found before, and the possibility of another great city, another Tenochtitlan, another Cusco, was not an unreasonable thing to hope for. They had already found two civilizations of extraordinary complexity and wealth. The idea that there might be a third somewhere in the unmapped East was not pure fantasy. It was an extrapolation from experience. The legend drifted through the centuries in this way, never quite dying and never quite being confirmed. It showed up in travellers' accounts and missionaries' reports and the occasional official survey. By the 19th century, it had become a fixture of the romantic imagination of Central America. One of those persistent stories that gets retold because it feels true even when it cannot be verified. The Mosquito and other indigenous communities of the region had their own stories about the interior, and some of these stories, as they were recorded and translated by outside observers, seemed to confirm that something significant existed deep in the forest. Whether these stories were describing the same thing as the Spanish rumours, or something entirely different, or whether they were being interpreted through a lens that shaped what outside listeners heard, is genuinely difficult to say. The story entered a new phase in 1940, when an American adventurer and museum curator named Theodore Maud led an expedition into La Mosquitia under the sponsorship of the High Foundation, which ran the Museum of the American Indian in New York. Maud was 30 years old, had some experience in Central America, and possessed the particular combination of genuine curiosity and self-promotional energy that characterized a certain kind of American explorer in the early 20th century. He spent several months in the region with a colleague named Lawrence Brown, travelling by river and on foot, making contact with local communities and pushing further into the interior than most outside expeditions had managed. When Maud returned to the United States in the summer of 1940, he gave interviews claiming that he had found the city of the monkey god. He described a large ruined settlement, stone structures, evidence of a sophisticated ancient culture. He brought back artifacts. He spoke to newspapers and gave lectures. The story was picked up widely. It was, after all, exactly the kind of discovery that people in 1940 wanted to read about. A lost city in the jungle, ancient ruins, an American adventurer who had gone where others had not dared to go. But Morday never revealed the coordinates. He never published a formal account of what he had found or where exactly he had found it. He said he was withholding the location to prevent the site from being looted before a proper scientific expedition could be organised. That expedition never happened. The Second World War intervened, and then the post-war years, and then in 1954, Theodore Maud was found dead in London, apparently by suicide at the age of 44. The coordinates, if they ever existed in any precise form, died with him. What he left behind was a story, specific enough to feel credible, vague enough to be impossible to verify or disprove. His field notes and journals were held by various parties over the decades and have been partially examined by researchers, but they do not contain a clear description of the site's location. Some researchers who have looked at the available evidence believe that Maud genuinely found something, some kind of archaeological site that impressed him, and that he interpreted through the framework of the Ciudad Blanca legend. Others think he exaggerated or fabricated parts of his account for publicity purposes. The honest answer is that no one knows. Maud's expedition is one of those historical episodes that remains genuinely unresolved, not because the truth is being hidden, but because the evidence is simply insufficient. What the Maud story did, regardless of its accuracy, was to fix the Ciudad Blanca legend firmly in the popular imagination of the 20th century. After 1940, the lost city of La Mosquitia was no longer just a vague historical rumour. It had a specific shape in people's minds. A city of monkey god worshippers, hidden in the Honduran jungle, found once by a man who refused to say where it was, and then died before he could. That is a story with a particular gravitational pull. It invites continuation. It almost demands that someone go back and look, and people did go back. The decades after Maud's death saw a steady trickle of expeditions, surveys and searches, most of them poorly documented and none of them conclusive. The legend kept attracting attention partly because it was never definitively debunked. No one had found the city, but no one had proven it did not exist either. In the absence of evidence either way, the story could sustain itself indefinitely on the fuel of possibility. What makes this more interesting than a simple case of myth-making is that there is, underneath the legend, a genuine archaeological question. The interior of La Mosquitia is not empty. That much was suspected by serious researchers long before the modern era of aerial survey. The region's rivers had supported human populations for thousands of years. The cultures of the Honduran interior were less well understood than the Maya to the northwest or the Aztec to the north, but they were not absent. Ceramic traditions, burial practices, stone carving, evidence of complex societies existed in the region, scattered across museum collections and partial excavations. The question was not whether people had lived in the interior of La Mosquitia in the pre-Columbian period. They clearly had. The question was what kind of societies they had built, how large those societies had been, and what had happened to them. The Ciudad Blanca legend in this light is not pure fantasy. It is a distorted reflection of something real, the fact that significant human cultures existed in this region, and that almost nothing is known about them. The distortion comes from the way the legend frames the question, as a search for a single great city, a lost capital, a dramatic discovery waiting to be made. Real archaeology rarely works that way. Societies do not usually concentrate themselves in one place waiting to be found. They spread across landscapes, build and abandon and rebuild, leave traces that require patient, systematic work to understand. The idea of a Ciudad Blanca, one white city, one definitive discovery, is a European and American narrative imposed on a much more complicated reality. But the narrative was powerful enough to drive behaviour for a century. It sent Theodore Maud into the jungle in 1940. It sent others after him. It shaped the way journalists and filmmakers and adventurers thought about the region. And it eventually contributed to the circumstances that led to the most significant development in the modern history of La Mosquitia's archaeology. Not an expedition in the traditional sense, but a technological intervention that changed what it was even possible to know about the region from the outside. Before that happened, though, the legend had to run its course through several more decades of attempts and retreats and incomplete discoveries. The pattern of those attempts, the way they kept reaching the same limits, stopping at the same rivers, turning back in the face of the same obstacles, says something about both the power of the idea and the genuine difficulty of the terrain. People were not failing to find the Ciudad Blanca because they were incompetent or unlucky. They were failing because the forest made failure almost inevitable, and the legend kept sending new people in to fail in the same ways. There is something almost mechanical about it in retrospect. A story circulates about a great city in the jungle. Someone organises an expedition. The expedition reaches the river margins, or maybe a little further. The train defeats them. Flooding, illness, supply problems, the sheer physical difficulty of moving through a forest that does not want to be moved through. They return with partial information, ambiguous evidence, stories that confirm the legend without resolving it. The story circulates again, slightly enriched by the new attempt, and eventually someone else organises another expedition. The cycle repeats. What the legend did, in a certain sense, was to keep directing human attention toward a region that would otherwise have been largely ignored by the outside world. That is not entirely a bad thing. Some of the people who went into La Mosquitia in search of the Ciudad Blanca came back with genuine observations about the ecology, the indigenous communities, the geography. The legend was a kind of engine, imperfect and distorting, but it kept the region in view when it might otherwise have been forgotten entirely by the institutions and media that fund and publicise exploration. Whether the thing the legend was pointing toward, some concentration of pre-Columbian architecture, some evidence of a complex urban society in the deep interior, actually existed was still, by the early 21st century, an open question. The archaeological community was sceptical of the Ciudad Blanca framing, but not dismissive of the underlying possibility. The forest was too thick, the surveys too incomplete, the ground too difficult to reach. No one could say with confidence what was or was not under that canopy. That uncertainty is what made the next development so significant, because by the 2000s there was a new way of looking at what lay beneath a forest canopy, a technology that did not require anyone to walk through the mud and the fer-de-lance territory and the botfly zones to see what was there. It was a technology that could, in theory, answer the basic question that the Ciudad Blanca legend had been asking for 5 centuries. Is there anything down there? And when it was finally applied to La Mosquitia, the answer it gave was more complicated and more interesting than either the true believers or the skeptics had expected. But before that technology arrived, the expeditions kept coming. And what is worth understanding about them is not just that they failed, it is how they failed, and how consistently, and what that consistency reveals about the nature of the place itself. The pattern had been established long before the mid-20th century, but it becomes easier to trace from around the 1950s onward, when documentation improved and the people involved were more likely to leave written records. In 1952, a Yugoslav-Argentine explorer named Tibor Sekelj made an attempt to penetrate the interior of La Mosquitia. Sekelj was not an amateur. He had travelled extensively across South America and written several books about his expeditions. He was experienced with difficult terrain, with river travel, with the logistics of moving through remote forest. He entered the region from the coast, following one of the river systems inland. He got a certain distance. Then the river became unnavigable. The forest closed in, supply calculations began to fail, and he turned back. He wrote about the experience in terms that would become familiar across the accounts of later expeditions. The sense that the forest was not simply difficult, but somehow resistant, that it absorbed effort without yielding ground. He did not find the Ciudad Blanca. He did not find any ruins of significance. He returned with observations about the landscape and the indigenous communities he had encountered, and the interior remained as unknown as before. Through the 1960s, the Honduran government conducted a series of aerial and ground surveys of the region, partly motivated by a general interest in national territory and partly by the persistent legend of the White City. These surveys were not well funded or systematically documented, and the records that survive are incomplete. What they established broadly was a clearer picture of the river systems and the general topography, but aerial observation from the aircraft of that era could not penetrate the canopy, and ground surveys were limited to the river margins. The interior remained a blank. The surveys confirmed what anyone who had looked at a map already suspected, that the region was large, that it was wet, and that moving through it was extraordinarily difficult. They did not resolve the archaeological question. They could not. By the 1990s, the expeditions had become somewhat more organised, and the technology available to them had improved. GPS navigation, better communications equipment, lighter materials. None of this changed the fundamental arithmetic of the problem. In 1997, a British adventurer named Steve Morgan led a small team into the region with the specific goal of pushing further into the interior than previous expeditions had managed. Morgan was experienced with jungle travel in other parts of the world, and he had done his research. His team entered along the Rio Platano, which is one of the main river arteries of the Biosphere Reserve and the most logical entry point from the coast. They travelled upriver for several days. The going was slow, the river braided and shifted, sections were too shallow for their boats, others were running too fast after recent rain. They made camps, moved supplies, tried to push inland from the river on foot. The forest floor was waterlogged. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters per day rather than kilometers. After about 2 weeks, the team had reached a point that was still, by any practical measure, on the outer margin of the interior. They had not penetrated the core. Supply calculations said they could not continue without resupply, and resupply was not possible. They turned back. What is instructive about Morgan's account is the specificity of the logistical failure. It was not that the team was overwhelmed by a single dramatic event. No one was seriously injured. No catastrophic river crossing went wrong. No medical emergency forced an evacuation. The expedition simply ran out of the capacity to continue. The forest consumed resources, food, energy, time, equipment, at a rate that outpaced what the team had been able to carry in. Moving through the terrain required so much physical effort that caloric consumption was much higher than pre-expedition estimates had allowed for. Gear degraded faster in the constant moisture. The team was tired in a way that accumulated rather than resolved with rest, because rest in that environment is never truly restorative. The humidity, the insects, the need to maintain camp against constant biological pressure all continue through the night. The expedition reached its limit not at a wall but at a slow gradient of diminishing capacity, and then it turned around. This pattern, supply collapse, energy depletion, the slow accumulation of small difficulties into an insurmountable total, is the dominant mode of failure in La Mosquitia. It is less dramatic than a sudden disaster, but it is more absolute. A sudden disaster can sometimes be overcome or worked around. A gradual collapse of the conditions that make forward movement possible cannot. The supply problem deserves a little more attention, because it is easy to underestimate how completely it shapes what is possible in this region. In most remote environments, the fundamental supply challenge is carrying enough food and equipment to last until you reach your destination or return to a resupply point. In La Mosquitia, the problem is compounded by the fact that the terrain itself destroys supplies. Food stored in the humidity molds within days. Equipment that is not carefully waterproofed fails. Medicines degrade. Boots, even high-quality ones, begin to deteriorate within a week of constant immersion. The weight of supplies that must be carried per day of travel is therefore significantly higher than in drier environments, because a meaningful portion of what you carry will not survive to be used, and the weight of supplies limits how fast you can move, which extends the number of days required, which requires more supplies. The mathematics of this feedback loop are not favourable. Airstrips exist in a few locations within the broader Mosquitia region, small cleared areas that can accommodate light aircraft in dry conditions. But these are rare. Their locations are not always reliable on published maps, and their usability is highly weather dependent. A strip that is functional in February may be completely unusable in June. The 2015 National Geographic expedition, which we will come to shortly, was flown in by helicopter precisely because there was no reliable airstrip near the target site. Helicopter access is expensive, weather-dependent, and requires coordination with Honduran military or government aviation. It is not something a small independent expedition can easily arrange. For most of the expeditions of the 20th century, air resupply was simply not a realistic option. You carried what you could carry, and when it ran out, you left. The 1994 attempt by a joint US-Honduran team is worth noting specifically because it illustrates a different category of failure, not slow supply collapse but acute crisis. The details of this expedition are not extensively documented in the public record, but what is known is that the team attempted a crossing of one of the major rivers during a period of elevated water levels. The crossing went wrong. Exactly what happened varies depending on the account, but the result was that equipment was lost, at least one team member was injured, and the group was no longer capable of continuing. A helicopter extraction was arranged, which itself required favourable weather and took time to organise. The team was extracted without achieving its objectives. The river, swollen with seasonal rain, had simply ended the expedition in the space of a few hours. River crossings in La Mosquitia are not the kind of challenge that skill and preparation can reliably overcome. The rivers here are not like the rivers in most other remote regions. They're wide, fast and unpredictable. Their banks are often undercut and unstable. The current during rainy season carries debris, logs, branches, sometimes entire uprooted trees, that can strike a swimmer or a small boat with enough force to cause serious injury. Crocodiles are present in several of the river systems. The water is often opaque with sediment, which makes reading the current and the bottom nearly impossible. Experienced river travellers from other parts of the world have described the rivers of La Mosquitia as among the most technically demanding they have encountered, not because of any single dramatic feature, but because of the combination of factors that make a mistake at any point potentially catastrophic. Steve Elkins is a figure who appears in the La Mosquitia story in a slightly different role from the traditional expedition leader. He was a filmmaker, not an archaeologist or an adventurer in the classic sense, and his approach to the region was shaped by that background. He became interested in the Ciudad Blanca legend in the 1990s and spent years researching it, interviewing people who had attempted to enter the region, reviewing historical documents, talking to indigenous community members. He flew over the region in small aircraft in 2009, trying to get a visual sense of what the interior looked like from the air. What he saw was canopy. Unbroken, impenetrable canopy, stretching in every direction. The forest gave nothing away. But Elkins was aware of a technology that had been developing through the 2000s and that was beginning to be applied to archaeological questions in other parts of the world. That technology was LIDAR, light detection and ranging, and its potential application to a place like La Mosquitia was, to anyone who understood both the technology and the problem, immediately obvious. The forest canopy that blocked every aerial visual survey and made ground survey so difficult was not, in principle, an obstacle to laser-based scanning. LIDAR works by firing millions of laser pulses per second from an aircraft and measuring the time it takes for each pulse to return. Most pulses hit the canopy and return immediately, but some, a small percentage, find gaps between leaves and branches and penetrate all the way to the ground. By collecting enough of these ground-level returns and processing them mathematically, it is possible to reconstruct the shape of the terrain beneath the forest. Not perfectly, not in complete detail, but well enough to see whether the ground is flat or shaped, whether there are geometric features that might indicate human construction, whether the landscape has been modified in ways that natural erosion alone would not explain. Elkins began working toward a LIDAR survey of the region he was most interested in, a section of the interior that historical documents and indigenous oral accounts had most consistently associated with the Ciudad Blanca legend. Getting the survey organised took years. It required funding. It required coordination with the Honduran government. It required the involvement of the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping at the University of Houston, which had the aircraft and the processing capability to do the work. The first significant survey flights happened in 2010 and 2012. The 2012 survey covered approximately 140 square kilometres of interior forest, a relatively small area in the context of La Mosquitia's total extent, but a carefully chosen one. When the data came back and was processed, it showed something. Not nothing. Something. There were features in the landscape that did not look like natural geology. There were shapes, regular, geometric, arranged in patterns, that suggested human modification of the ground surface. Mounds, plazas, what appeared to be causeways connecting elevated areas. The features were consistent with pre-Columbian earthwork construction, the kind of landscape modification that complex societies in the Americas had undertaken for centuries before European contact. This did not confirm the Ciudad Blanca. It did not confirm any specific legend or story. What it confirmed was that the interior of La Mosquitia, in at least one location, contained evidence of significant human activity from the pre-Columbian period. The question of exactly what that evidence represented, which culture, which period, what scale of society, could not be answered from the LIDAR data alone. The laser sees shapes. It does not read pottery sequences or carbon date organic material, or identify the cultural affiliation of a stone tool. To answer those questions, someone would have to go in. And going in, as decades of failed and partial expeditions had demonstrated, was not a simple proposition. The LIDAR had changed the epistemological situation entirely. It had moved the question from "is there anything there?" to "what exactly is there?" But it had done nothing to change the physical reality of the forest, the rivers, the insects, the snakes, the humidity, the supply mathematics, or the accumulated weight of everything that made La Mosquitia so resistant to human presence. The technology had given researchers a reason to try again, a specific target, a justification for the considerable effort and expense that a ground expedition would require. Whether the ground expedition would succeed, and what it would cost the people who made it, was another question entirely. The forest had been absorbing expeditions for centuries without much apparent concern for the reasons they had come. It was not likely to make an exception for a well-funded team with satellite phones and GPS coordinates and LIDAR printouts in their waterproof bags. The terrain does not negotiate. It simply continues to be what it is, and what it is had already proven, many times over, to be more than most people were prepared for. So the data existed. The shapes were there in the processed scans, rendered in false-colour elevation maps that archaeologists and the Honduran government could look at together in a quiet room somewhere far from the forest itself. Mounds, a central plaza. What the analysts described as a low-density urban landscape, the kind of spatial organisation that implied planning, that implied a society capable of coordinating large-scale earthwork construction over a sustained period of time. The site was designated T1, a simple alphanumeric label, the kind of neutral technical shorthand that researchers use before they know what they are dealing with. Later it would sometimes be called Site 1, or referred to informally by journalists as the Lost City, though the archaeologists involved were careful about that framing from the beginning. The announcement came publicly in 2015, and the coverage was significant. Major newspapers, documentary coverage, the kind of media attention that a phrase like Lost City in the Jungle reliably generates. But the people who had actually worked with the data were measured in their language. What the LIDAR had revealed was real, that much was clear. The geometry of the features was not consistent with natural landforms. The arrangement of mounds around a central open area, the linear features that might be causeways or drainage channels, the overall spatial logic of the site, these were consistent with what archaeologists recognized as deliberate landscape modification. The central plaza alone, based on the LIDAR returns, appeared to be roughly 500 meters in length. That is not a small space. That is the kind of scale that implies a community, a purpose, a sustained investment of human labor over time. But the LIDAR data also had clear limits, and the researchers said so. The laser cannot distinguish between a mound built in 800 CE and one built in 1400 CE. It cannot tell you whether the people who built a given structure were related culturally to the people who built a structure 50 kilometers away. It cannot confirm whether a site was continuously occupied, seasonally used, or abandoned after a single generation. It gives you shape and elevation. Everything else requires ground truth, which is the archaeological term for actually being there, digging carefully, collecting samples, reading the stratigraphy of the soil, finding the fragments of daily life that tell you who was present and when. Steve Elkins had the LiDAR data. He had the coordinates. He had the Honduran government's support, which was genuine and practically significant. The Honduran military would need to be involved in any ground expedition, both for logistics and for security. What he needed now was an archaeological team willing to go in, and the logistical infrastructure to get them there and bring them back out alive. The forest was not going to make that easy. It never had. The team that eventually assembled for the 2015 ground expedition was a mix of disciplines and roles, which made sense given the complexity of what they were attempting. Chris Fisher was the lead archaeologist, a professor at Colorado State University who specializes in complex societies in Mesoamerica and whose work has increasingly involved remote sensing and LiDAR analysis. Douglas Preston, a journalist and author who had been following the Ciudad Blanca story for years, was there to document the expedition and later wrote a book about it. Steve Elkins was present as the project's originator. There were filmmakers, there were Honduran Special Forces soldiers providing security, there were support staff. Getting all of them to the site required helicopters, because there was no other way in. A small clearing had been identified from the aerial surveys, barely large enough to land, surrounded by forest on every side, the kind of landing zone that helicopter pilots approach with particular care. They arrived in February 2015. February is theoretically part of the drier season in the region, which is a relative term. Drier in La Mosquitia still means frequent rain, high humidity, and ground that is soft and unstable underfoot. The temperature on the ground was around 30 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was close to 100%. The canopy above them was so dense that direct sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. In the shade and the wet, the air had a quality that multiple expedition members described as oppressive, not dramatically dangerous in any single moment, but continuously exhausting in a way that accumulated over days. They had 9 days on the ground. That was the window that logistics and supply allowed. 9 days is not very long for archaeological work under any circumstances. For work in this environment, it was barely enough to confirm that the LiDAR data was accurate and to begin a preliminary surface assessment. They were not there to excavate. That would require a separate expedition with different equipment and much more time. They were there to ground truth the shapes the laser had seen. What they found confirmed the data. The mounds were real. The plaza was real. The spatial arrangement matched what the LiDAR had suggested, which was itself a significant result. It validated the methodology and demonstrated that LiDAR could be trusted as a survey tool in this kind of environment. And then, near the base of one of the mounds, they found something else. A cache of stone artifacts partially exposed at the surface. 52 objects in total, or thereabouts. The exact count varied slightly across different accounts. Carved stone vessels, metates, which are the flat grinding stones used for processing grain and other foods, often elaborately decorated in pre-Columbian cultures, and among them a were-jaguar sculpture. A figure that combines human and jaguar features, a form that appears across multiple Mesoamerican and Central American cultures and carries significant ceremonial meaning. The objects were old. They had been there for a long time. The forest had grown over and around them, and the roots of trees had begun to work into the stone, and the surface of some pieces was thick with moss and biological growth. Per Honduran law, the artifacts were left in place. This is important to say clearly because the history of archaeology in the Americas includes a great deal of removal, displacement, and institutional appropriation of objects that belong to the cultures that made them and to the nations where they were found. The Honduran government's position was that the objects should remain where they were, documented but undisturbed, until a proper excavation could be organised with the resources and the methodology to do the work responsibly. The team photographed and recorded everything they could in the time they had, and then they left the cache as they had found it, under the roots and the moss in the shadow of the mound. 9 days. Then the helicopters came back and the team flew out. The aftermath of the expedition was not straightforward. When the members returned and underwent medical evaluation, a significant number of them, accounts vary, but multiple sources indicate that nearly all of the team members who had spent time on the ground were diagnosed with cutaneous leishmaniasis. This is the disease caused by leishmania parasites transmitted through the bites of infected sandflies, the same condition that had been documented in researchers entering the region in earlier years. Cutaneous leishmaniasis, in its milder forms, causes skin ulcers, lesions that develop at the site of the sandfly bite and can persist for months if untreated. In more serious cases, or if left untreated, it can progress to more severe forms that affect mucous membranes or internal organs. Treatment for leishmaniasis is not simple. The standard medications used for the condition, including antimonial compounds and miltefosine, have significant side effects and require extended courses of treatment. Some of the 2015 expedition members required months of medical care after returning. Douglas Preston wrote about his own treatment in considerable detail, describing the process as unpleasant and drawn out. The disease had been there in the forest the whole time, invisible, carried by insects too small to see, and it had done what it always does in La Mosquitia. It had found the people who came in from outside. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The team had done everything right, or as right as it was possible to do in that environment. They had medical support, they had protective gear, they had insect repellent and long sleeves and awareness of the risks. They were there for 9 days, not 9 months. And still the forest extracted a biological toll that followed them home and required months to address. The image of the expedition returning in helicopters with photographs of stone artifacts and leader confirmations is one kind of story. The successful discovery story. The image of those same people undergoing treatment for a parasitic disease for months afterward is a different kind of story, and both of them are true at the same time. The LIDAR had changed what was known. The ground expedition had confirmed that the knowledge was real. But neither of those things had changed the fundamental nature of the environment. The forest was the same forest it had always been. The sandflies were the same sandflies. The rain came the same way it always came, and the rivers rose and fell on their own schedule, and the canopy closed overhead with complete indifference to what had just been accomplished beneath it. What the 2015 expedition had done was establish a beachhead of knowledge, a confirmed location, documented artifacts, a validated methodology. It had also established, with uncomfortable clarity, the cost of that knowledge. Every subsequent expedition to the site would face the same biological risks, the same logistical constraints, the same 9-day window or something close to it, the same dependence on helicopters and military support and careful medical preparation. The forest had not become more accessible because someone had gone in and come back out. It had simply allowed a brief visit and then resumed being what it was. There is something almost administrative about the way the forest handles expeditions. It does not fight back dramatically. It does not produce a single catastrophic event that turns people away. It simply maintains its conditions, the humidity, the insects, the soft ground, the rivers, the biological load. And those conditions do what they have always done. They wear people down, they infect them, they make every step take longer than it should and every task harder than it appears on paper. The forest's resistance is not theatrical, it is procedural. The stone cache at the base of the mound sat back in the rain after the helicopters left. The wood jaguar looked at whatever it had always looked at. The roots continued their slow work. Somewhere above, the canopy closed over the clearing that had been cut for the landing zone, beginning the process of reclaiming it. In a forest that receives this much rain and grows this fast, a clearing does not stay a clearing for long. What the archaeologists had in their hands now was data, good data, confirmed data, the kind of data that justifies further work and further funding, and the slow, careful process of building an understanding of what the T1 site actually was, who built it, and what happened to the people who lived there. Those questions were not going to be answered quickly. They were not going to be answered from a distance. Answering them properly would require going back in, and going back in would require solving the same problems that had made every previous expedition so difficult and so costly. The LIDAR had given the work a destination. It had not given it a road, and the destination itself was still mostly unknown in the ways that matter most to archaeologists. The shapes in the data were confirmed, but shapes are the beginning of a question, not the answer to one. What culture had built these mounds? What period? What had happened to the people who lived here? And when and why had the forest grown back over everything so completely that centuries of aerial surveys had seen nothing? Those questions were waiting in the ground, under the moss, next to the were-jaguar and the carved stone vessels and the slow roots of trees that had been growing there since long before anyone with a laser scanner had thought to look. So let us stay with those questions for a moment, because they are the ones that archaeologists like Chris Fisher came home carrying, alongside the leishmaniasis diagnosis and the photographs and the GPS coordinates. The LiDAR data had given the T1 site a shape. The 2015 ground expedition had confirmed that the shape corresponded to something real. Real stone, real earthworks, real evidence of human construction at a scale that required organised labour and planning. But the deeper questions, the ones that archaeologists actually need to answer to say something meaningful about a place, those were still almost entirely open. The first and most fundamental question is one of identity. The T1 site is not confirmed to be the Ciudad Blanca of legend. It is worth being very clear about this, because the media coverage around the 2015 announcement was not always careful about the distinction. The name Ciudad Blanca, the White City, is a legend, a story that has accumulated layers over centuries, a narrative that has drawn explorers and adventurers and journalists for 100 years. It is not an archaeological designation. Chris Fisher and the other researchers involved in the 2015 work were careful to avoid using the name in their formal publications, precisely because attaching a legend to a site before you understand the site is a way of obscuring rather than revealing what is actually there. What the evidence actually shows is more interesting than the legend in a quieter way. The earthworks at T1 are consistent with pre-Columbian construction in the region, dating roughly to the period between 1000 and 1400 CE, roughly speaking the same centuries during which Chichen Itza was at its height in the Yucatan, though the cultures are entirely distinct and should not be conflated. The mounds, the plazas, the causeways visible in the LIDAR data suggest a society capable of significant coordinated construction. The artifacts recovered from the stone cache, the carved vessels, the stone seats known as meter-teres, the were-jaguar figure, are consistent with ritual and domestic use by a complex society, not a small transient group. Someone lived here, or used this place regularly, over an extended period of time. But what society? That is the harder question. The Honduran interior in the pre-Columbian period contained a number of distinct cultural groups, and the archaeology of the region is poorly understood compared to the better studied civilizations of Mesoamerica to the north or the Andes to the south. Part of the reason for this is simply the difficulty of working there. Excavating a site in La Mosquitia is not like excavating a site in a dry highland valley, where the stratigraphy is stable and the artifacts are well preserved. In a tropical rainforest with this much rainfall, organic materials decompose quickly, soil layers get disturbed by root systems and flooding, and the physical process of excavation is complicated by the same conditions that make every other activity in the region so difficult. You cannot dig carefully in a foot of standing water. You cannot maintain an open trench through a week of continuous rain. The environment that preserved the stone artifacts in the cache also destroyed everything made of wood or fibre or bone that might have been sitting beside them. Fisher's analysis, drawing on the LiDAR data and the ground observations from 2015, suggests that what existed at T1 was probably not a single great city in the sense that the legend implies, not a dense urban centre comparable to Teotihuacan or Tikal. The more likely interpretation, based on the spatial distribution of the earthworks, is something more like a regional centre in a network of smaller settlements, a place of significance within a broader cultural landscape rather than a capital of a unified civilization. This is actually a pattern seen in other parts of lowland tropical America. Complex societies organised around networks of centres rather than single dominant cities, connected by rivers and trade routes rather than paved roads, dispersed through the landscape in ways that make them harder to see from the outside, but no less sophisticated in their organisation. The question of what happened to the people who built T1 is one that the physical evidence cannot yet fully answer, but there are reasonable hypotheses. The most significant is the one that applies to most of the Americas: European contact. When Spanish explorers and colonizers arrived in the early 16th century, they brought with them diseases to which indigenous populations had no prior exposure: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. The demographic collapse that followed was catastrophic on a scale that is still difficult to fully comprehend. In some regions of the Americas, population estimates suggest that between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population died within a century of European arrival, not primarily from violence but from disease. A society reduced to that degree does not maintain cities. It does not maintain agricultural systems or trade networks or the social structures that keep complex settlements functioning. It contracts, retreats, and in many cases disappears as a distinct cultural entity. For the people of the Honduran interior, the specific timeline of this collapse is not well documented, partly because the Spanish never successfully penetrated the region in force. But the disease did not need soldiers to travel. It moved along trade routes, carried by people who did not know they were sick, reaching communities that had never seen a European face. It is entirely plausible, some researchers would say likely, that the settlements of the T1 region were already in severe decline or completely abandoned by the time the first Spanish documents mention rumours of a great city to the east. Hernán Cortés wrote to King Charles I in 1526. The city he was hearing rumours about may have already been empty for a generation or more. The forest is very good at reclaiming abandoned spaces. This is worth understanding in concrete terms. In a tropical rainforest with annual rainfall exceeding 2,800 millimetres, vegetation growth is not a slow process. A cleared field can be colonised by pioneer plants within weeks. Within a decade, secondary forest can be dense enough to provide significant canopy cover. Within a century, a site that was once an open plaza surrounded by buildings could be so thoroughly overgrown that the earthworks beneath the vegetation are invisible from the air and nearly invisible on the ground. The mounds at T1 were not preserved because the forest left them alone. They were preserved because the forest grew over them and held them in place. The root systems and accumulated organic material actually stabilising the earthworks rather than destroying them. The stone artefacts in the cache survived because stone survives. Everything else, the wooden structures, the thatched roofs, the textiles, the food, the people, was absorbed back into the biological cycle of the forest within a few generations of abandonment. This is the context in which the 2015 expedition's work has to be understood. They had confirmed a real site. They had documented its general shape and recovered a small sample of its artifacts. But the work of actually understanding the site, its chronology, its cultural affiliation, its relationship to other sites in the region, the lives of the people who built and used it, that work had barely begun. It would require multiple return expeditions, careful excavation under controlled conditions, laboratory analysis of soil samples and artifact materials, and the slow accumulation of comparative data from other sites in the region. It would require, in other words, years of work under conditions that had already demonstrated their capacity to make work extremely difficult and to extract a significant biological cost from the people attempting it. Fisher has continued his analysis using remote sensing data in the years since 2015. Additional LIDAR surveys have been conducted over other parts of the region, and the emerging picture is one that makes the T1 site seem less like an isolated anomaly and more like one node in a broader landscape of pre-Columbian occupation. There are other earthwork complexes visible in the data. Some researchers who have examined the surveys estimate there may be dozens of sites across La Mosquitia that show evidence of significant pre-Columbian construction. Mounds, causeways, modified water features, the kinds of landscape alterations that indicate sustained human occupation over long periods. Most of these sites have never been visited on the ground. Most of them probably will not be visited for a long time, given the conditions. There is something genuinely strange about this situation. We live in an era when satellite imagery covers virtually every square metre of the Earth's surface, when LIDAR surveys can reveal the shapes of buried structures through 3 metres of forest canopy, when GPS coordinates can place you within a few metres of any point on the planet. And yet there are dozens of sites in La Mosquitia that have been identified from the air and cannot be reached on the ground. The knowledge exists in a kind of suspended state, precise enough to be real, inaccessible enough to be essentially unusable for the kind of close study that would actually answer the important questions. It is a strange position for archaeology to be in. Usually the problem is not knowing where to look. Here the problem is being able to look but not being able to touch. The 52 artifacts that were documented in the stone cache at T1 are still there. This is worth noting. Under Honduran law, the artifacts could not be removed from the site without a formal excavation permit and the involvement of the Honduran Institute of Anthropology and History. The 2015 expedition photographed and catalogued them and then left them in place. The Wajagua figure, the carved stone vessels, the metates. They are sitting in the forest right now in the same position they were in when the expedition found them, slowly being reclaimed by moss and root systems and the patient indifference of the forest. They are protected by law and also, more effectively, by geography. Getting back to them requires solving the same set of problems that the 2015 team solved, and solving them again and again after that, every time someone wants to do more work at the site. It is also worth noting what the 2015 expedition did not find, or more precisely, what it could not determine. The LIDAR data showed structures consistent with a significant settlement. The ground visit confirmed that the structures were real, but the expedition did not conduct any formal archaeological excavation. They did not dig. They did not take samples for radiocarbon dating. They did not establish the chronology of the site with any precision. The date range of 1000 to 1400 CE is an inference based on comparative regional data, not a result of direct analysis of the T1 site itself. The cultural affiliation of the site, which specific pre-Columbian group built these structures, is not established. The relationship between T1 and the indigenous communities currently living in the region is not understood. These are not small gaps. They are fundamental questions, and the answers are still in the ground, inaccessible, waiting for conditions that will allow the careful work of excavation to actually happen. What the 2015 expedition had accomplished, then, was something important, but also something limited. It had moved the T1 site from the category of aerial speculation into the category of confirmed archaeological reality. That is not a small thing. Before 2015, the LIDAR data existed but had not been ground-truthed, had not been confirmed by physical presence at the site. After 2015, the site was real in a way that could not be disputed. The stone artifacts were documented. The photographs existed. The GPS coordinates were confirmed. The research community could proceed on the basis of verified knowledge rather than interpreted remote sensing data. But the forest had made its position clear. 9 days, helicopters in and helicopters out, leishmaniasis for nearly everyone, the artifacts left in place, the excavation not conducted, the chronology not established, the cultural identity not confirmed, the dozens of other sites in the LIDAR data unvisited. The forest had allowed a brief visit, had permitted the confirmation of what the laser scanning had suggested, and had then reasserted its conditions with complete consistency. The same rain, the same insects, the the same soft ground and rising rivers and biological load, the same procedural resistance that it had always offered to anyone who came in from outside. Understanding what was actually built at T1 and by whom and when and why the forest grew back over it so completely, that understanding was still mostly ahead of the researchers who had done the hard work of getting there in the first place. The archaeology of La Mosquitia is a field that has been opened by technology and is still waiting for the conditions that would allow it to advance. The shapes are visible, the questions are clear. The ground between the question and the answer is, as it has always been, the forest itself. And the forest, for its part, is not only an obstacle to archaeology, it is something else entirely, a living system of extraordinary complexity and richness, one that has been quietly doing what it does for thousands of years, while the expeditions came and went and the legends accumulated and the LIDAR data filled up hard drives in university servers. What lives inside La Mosquitia is not just the past. It is one of the most biologically dense ecosystems in the Western Hemisphere, and its relationship to the inaccessibility that makes archaeology so difficult is more complicated than it might first appear. So let us stay with the archaeology for a moment, because the question of who actually built the structures at T1 is more interesting and more complicated than the legend of the Ciudad Blanca ever allowed it to be. The name Ciudad Blanca, the White City, has a romantic weight to it that is hard to shake. It carries the suggestion of a single great civilization, a capital, a place of concentrated power and grandeur that was somehow lost to time and forest. That framing is understandable. It is how legends work. They compress complexity into a single vivid image. But the archaeological evidence that has slowly accumulated around the T1 site and the broader La Mosquitia region suggests something rather different from a lost capital. It suggests a landscape that was, for several centuries, home to a distributed network of communities, smaller centres connected by rivers and trade routes, each with its own earthworks and plazas and ceremonial spaces, none of them necessarily dominant over the others in the way that, say, Teotihuacan dominated central Mexico, or Tikal dominated the Petén. Chris Fisher, the archaeologist from Colorado State University, who led the ground survey component of the 2015 expedition, has been careful about this in his public statements. He has described the T1 site as evidence of a complex society with clear urban planning characteristics, the alignment of the mounds around the central plaza, the scale of the earth moving required to build the structures, the presence of a formal cache of ritual objects. All of these point to an organised community with the capacity to coordinate large-scale labour and to produce or acquire finely worked stone objects. But Fisher has also been consistent in noting that the T1 site is one node in what appears to be a larger regional pattern, not the centre of a single unified civilization. The LIDAR data from the 2012 survey showed multiple clusters of earthworks across the scanned area. T1 was the most clearly defined and the largest within that particular scan, but it was not isolated. There were other smaller groupings of mounds and plazas nearby. The picture that emerges is less of a lost city and more of a lost landscape, a region that was once inhabited by interacting communities, each leaving its own architectural signature in the forest floor. The date range that researchers have suggested, roughly 1000 to 1400 CE, places the occupation of these sites within what is sometimes called the late Classic and post-Classic periods in Mesoamerican archaeology, though it is worth being careful about applying those frameworks too directly to a region that sits outside the core Mesoamerican cultural zones. The Honduran interior had its own developmental trajectory, influenced by but not identical to the cultures of the Yucatan to the northwest or the Andean civilizations to the south. The stone artifacts found at T1, the carved vessels, the metates, the were-jaguar figure, have stylistic parallels with objects found elsewhere in Honduras and in neighbouring regions, but they are not straightforward copies of any single known tradition. They suggest a culture that was in contact with wider networks, but was doing something recognisably its own. One of the more quietly remarkable things about the were-jaguar figure specifically is what it implies about the ritual and cosmological life of whoever placed it in that cache. Were-jaguar imagery, figures that combine human and feline characteristics, appears across a wide swathe of pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas, from the Olmec of the Gulf Coast to various traditions in Lower Central America and Northern South America. Its presence at T1 does not tell us which specific group built the site, but it does place the site within a broader world of shared symbolic vocabulary. The people who made that figure were not isolated. They knew something of the wider world, or at least of the wider region, and they participated in a symbolic tradition that extended well beyond the forest they lived in. The question of cultural affiliation, which specific pre-Columbian group built T1, remains genuinely open. The Pech people, also known as the Paya, have lived in the Honduran interior highlands for centuries and are considered by some researchers to be possible descendants of the cultures that built the earthwork complexes in the region. The Tawaka, who live along the Patuca River, are another candidate. Some researchers have proposed connections to broader Chibchan-speaking cultures that extended through Lower Central America and into South America. None of these proposals have been confirmed. Without proper excavation, without stratigraphic analysis, without ceramic sequences, without organic material for radiocarbon dating, the cultural identity of the T1 builders remains an inference, not a finding. This is frustrating in the way that good archaeology often is. The more carefully you look at the evidence, the more you realise how much you do not yet know. The 2015 expedition confirmed that the site was real and significant. It did not answer the fundamental questions about who built it, when exactly they built it, how long they occupied it, or what their relationship was to the indigenous communities currently living in the region. Those questions are sitting in the ground at T1, and they are sitting in the forest at the dozens of other sites identified by LIDAR, and the conditions required to answer them: sustained excavation seasons, secure access, logistical infrastructure, formal collaboration with indigenous communities and the Honduran government, do not currently exist. The abandonment of the sites is, in some ways, the question that haunts the whole subject most quietly. Because the forest did not just grow over these settlements slowly over millennia. It reclaimed them within what was probably a few generations. The earthworks at T1 are substantial enough that they are still readable by LIDAR after centuries of forest growth, but the structures themselves are completely subsumed. The plazas are indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor without the laser data to guide you. The mounds look like natural hills. Whatever buildings stood on those mounds, and there were almost certainly wooden structures, since no stone architecture has been confirmed at the site, are completely gone. The forest absorbed them. Population collapse following European contact is the most widely accepted explanation for this kind of rapid abandonment across the Americas, and there is no reason to think La Mosquitia was an exception. The diseases that travelled ahead of the Spanish, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, moved through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed, often reaching communities that had never seen a European face. Estimates of population decline in the Americas between 1500 and 1600 CE range from 50% to as high as 90% in some regions. A community that loses that proportion of its members in a single generation does not maintain its infrastructure. It does not continue the labour of keeping plazas clear and mounds maintained and ceremonial caches tended. It survives, if it survives, by contracting, by pulling back to the river margins, by reducing its footprint, by doing what is necessary to continue existing under conditions of catastrophic loss. The forest, meanwhile, does not wait. In a tropical environment with La Mosquitia's rainfall and temperature, vegetation colonizes cleared ground within months. A plaza that is not actively maintained becomes overgrown within a year or two. Within a decade, the tree canopy is closed over it. Within a generation, the earthworks beneath are invisible to anyone walking through. The forest is not hostile to these sites in any intentional sense. It is simply doing what it does, which is to grow continuously and without pause, filling every available space with roots and canopy and undergrowth. The sites were not destroyed. They were covered, and covering in a forest this dense is effectively the same thing as disappearing, at least until a laser pulse from an aircraft at 600 meters altitude finds the shape of a mound beneath the canopy and sends the data back to a university server in Texas. There is something almost paradoxical about this. The same forest that makes the sites impossible to study is also the reason the sites still exist at all. If La Mosquitia had been accessible, if roads had been built through it in the 19th century, if agricultural colonization had proceeded, if the kind of development that transformed other parts of Honduras had reached the interior, the earthworks at T1 would very likely have been destroyed. Not deliberately, but incidentally, the way that pre-Columbian sites across the Americas have been leveled by ploughing, by construction, by the simple physical logic of people needing flat land for farms and buildings. The inaccessibility that has made these sites impossible to study is also the inaccessibility that preserved them. They survived because nobody could get to them. The forest hid them and, in hiding them, kept them. This is a strange kind of preservation. It is not the preservation of a museum, carefully controlled and documented. It is the preservation of complete neglect, the preservation of a place that has been left entirely alone because there was no practical alternative to leaving it alone. The 52 artefacts in the stone cache at T1 have been sitting in the forest for somewhere between 5 and 10 centuries. They have been rained on and grown over and surrounded by the biological activity of one of the most active ecosystems on Earth. They are not in perfect condition, but they are there. They exist. They can, in principle, be studied. That is more than can be said for the pre-Columbian sites that were cleared for sugar plantations in coastal Honduras, or for the sites that were bulldozed for road construction in other parts of Central America. The people who built T1 and the other sites scattered through the LIDAR data were not a lost civilization in the way that phrase is usually meant. They did not vanish mysteriously or leave without explanation. They were part of a broader pattern of demographic and cultural collapse that affected indigenous societies across the entire Western Hemisphere in the 16th and 17th centuries, a collapse driven by disease and displacement, and the systematic destruction of the social structures that had sustained those communities for generations. Their descendants, in many cases, are still in the region. The Pech and the Tawaka and the Mosquito communities along the rivers of La Mosquitia are not separate from this history. They are continuous with it, in ways that outside researchers are only beginning to understand and that the communities themselves have never forgotten. This is one of the reasons that the framing of a lost city has always been somewhat uncomfortable for the indigenous communities in the region. The idea that something was lost implies that no one knew it was there. But the Pech and the Tawaka have oral traditions that speak of the interior of the forest, of the sites and their significance, of the reasons why certain places are approached with care or avoided entirely. The knowledge was not lost. It was held by the communities who lived within the region's logic, in forms that outside researchers did not know how to ask about or listen to. The LIDAR survey revealed shapes that the laser could measure. It did not reveal the meaning of those shapes, which is a different kind of knowledge, and one that has been present in the region all along. What the archaeology of La Mosquitia is slowly working toward, slowly, because the conditions for doing it quickly do not exist, is a picture of the pre-Columbian Honduran interior that does not depend on legends or projections or the particular romance of the lost city. It is a picture of real communities, with real social structures and real ritual lives and real relationships to the landscape they inhabited, who were part of a connected world of trade and symbolic exchange that extended across lower Central America for centuries before European contact ended it. That picture is incomplete. Most of it is still in the ground. But the outline is there, visible in the LIDAR data and in the artifacts that were documented in 2015, and in the comparative regional archaeology that researchers have been building for decades. The forest covered the sites, but it did not erase the evidence. It just made the evidence very, very difficult to reach. And that difficulty, as it turns out, is not only an archaeological problem. The forest that has preserved these sites, the same forest that makes sustained excavation essentially impossible under current conditions, is itself something extraordinary, something that exists in a relationship with the region's inaccessibility that goes well beyond the question of buried earthworks. Because La Mosquitia is not just an archaeological puzzle, it is also one of the most biologically significant places in the Western Hemisphere, and the conditions that have kept researchers from properly studying the human past of the region are the same conditions that have kept that biological richness intact. The two things are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from different angles, and understanding one requires understanding the other. So let us stay with that idea for a moment, the forest as a kind of unintentional conservator. Because when you look at what actually lives inside La Mosquitia, the biological inventory of the place, the sheer density and variety of what has been documented just in the portions that researchers have managed to study, the word extraordinary starts to feel inadequate, not in a dramatic way, just in the plain factual sense that the numbers are hard to absorb. The Rio Platano biosphere reserve alone, and the reserve covers only a portion of the broader La Mosquitia region, has been documented to contain more than 2,000 plant species, over 600 species of birds, around 200 species of mammals. Those are not estimates in the loose, approximate sense. Those are documented counts from surveys, and researchers who work in the region consistently note that the actual totals are almost certainly higher, because the interior zones that are hardest to reach are also the zones least surveyed. What has been catalogued represents the accessible margins. The interior is still, in biological terms, largely uninventoried. To put some of those numbers in concrete terms, the reserve contains documented populations of jaguars, which require enormous home ranges and are among the first large predators to disappear when human activity fragments a landscape. It contains Baird's tapir, the largest land mammal in Central America, a species that is classified as endangered across most of its range but that appears to maintain a viable population in the La Mosquitia interior, giant anteaters, white-lipped peccaries, which travel in herds of sometimes hundreds of animals and need intact forest corridors to survive, the harpy eagle, one of the largest and most powerful raptors in the world, with a wingspan that can reach 2 meters, nests in the region. These are not species that coexist easily with human development. They are species that require large, intact, undisturbed habitat, and they are present in La Mosquitia because La Mosquitia has, by virtue of being impassable, remained large, intact, and undisturbed. The reserve was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. That designation recognised not just the biodiversity, but the integrity of the ecosystem, the fact that it was functioning as a connected whole rather than as a collection of isolated patches. And then, 14 years later, in 1996, UNESCO placed it on the list of World Heritage in danger, not because the interior had been damaged, but because the pressures at the edges were intensifying. Illegal cattle ranching was pushing in from the west and south. Agricultural colonization, driven partly by land scarcity in other parts of Honduras, was eating into the buffer zones. Logging operations were working along the river margins. The reserve was placed on the danger list again in 2011, for essentially the same reasons, because the pressures had not stopped. What is notable about the pattern of encroachment is where it is coming from. The threats to the Rio Platano Biosphere Reserve are not coming from the centre. They are coming from the edges. The interior, the deep interior, the zones that correspond most closely to the areas where the LiDAR surveys found earthwork complexes, remains largely intact. The same conditions that make it impossible for researchers to conduct sustained archaeological work. They also make it impossible for cattle ranchers to clear forest there, or for logging operations to extract timber, or for agricultural settlers to establish farms. The rivers flood, the ground is unstable. The distances are too great and the logistics too difficult. The impassability that frustrates scientific inquiry is the same impassability that has so far held the most destructive forms of development at bay. This creates a conservation paradox that people who work in the region think about quite carefully. The obvious solution to the archaeological problem, build better infrastructure, improve access, establish a permanent research station in the interior, is also a solution that would, in all likelihood, accelerate the destruction of the very thing being studied. Roads do not stay empty. Airstrips do not stay restricted. Once physical access to a remote area becomes reliably possible, the range of people and activities that can enter it expands in ways that are very difficult to control. The history of protected areas in Central America and across the tropics more broadly is full of examples of reserves that were formally protected but practically opened up by infrastructure development and then gradually colonized, logged, or converted to agriculture because the formal protections could not be enforced against the practical reality of access. The people who study La Mosquitia are aware of this. Chris Fisher, the archaeologist who led the ground survey in 2015, has spoken carefully about the tension between the scientific need to document and study the sites and the conservation reality that the inaccessibility of those sites is part of what makes them worth studying. You cannot fully separate the archaeological question from the ecological one. The forest that covered the earthworks at T1 is also the forest that shelters jaguars and harpy eagles and tapirs. Studying one without considering the other is not really possible, and any plan for expanded access to the region has to grapple with that. The Honduran government has, at various points, expressed interest in developing some form of ecotourism in the region, the idea being that controlled, well-managed visitor access could generate revenue while providing an economic justification for conservation. It is a model that has worked in some parts of the world, but the practical obstacles in La Mosquitia are severe. There are no roads into the interior. There are no reliable landing strips. There is no accommodation infrastructure, no medical support, no communication network. Building those things would require a level of investment that the Honduran government has not historically been able to commit, and doing it in a way that genuinely protected the ecosystem would require a degree of enforcement capacity that has also been lacking. The ecotourism idea tends to surface in policy discussions and then recede without producing anything concrete, partly because the gap between the idea and the reality of implementation is so large. There is also the question of who the land belongs to, in the most practical sense of that phrase. The indigenous communities who live within and around La Mosquitia, the Mosquito along the coast and the lower rivers, the Tawaka along the Patuca, the Pech in the highland areas, have territorial rights that are recognized to varying degrees under Honduran law. The Tawaka-Sangni Biosphere, established in 1999, was created partly in recognition of Tawaka territorial claims and covers roughly 2,300 square kilometers of the Middle Patuca Basin. The Mosquito communities have long-standing relationships with the coastal and riverine zones that they have inhabited for centuries. Any significant development plan for the region would require the consent and involvement of these communities, and the communities have, historically, had good reasons to be cautious about outside plans for their territory. Their caution is not abstract. The history of La Mosquitia is, in part, a history of outside interest arriving with plans for extraction, for conversion, for development of one kind or another, and those plans tending to benefit the outside interests more than the communities already living there. The British trading relationships of the 17th and 18th centuries extracted resources and left the Mosquito Kingdom in a position of strategic dependency. The Honduran government's integration of the Mosquito Coast in the 19th century was experienced by many communities as dispossession rather than inclusion. More recently, the expansion of cattle ranching and agricultural colonization into the buffer zones of the Biosphere Reserve has displaced communities and degraded the resource base that those communities depended on. The pattern is long enough and consistent enough that skepticism about new outside plans is entirely rational. What the reserve's ecology and the indigenous community's territorial claims have in common is that both are, in a certain sense, protected by the same thing: the difficulty of getting in. The forest is too wet, too dense, too far, too dangerous for casual exploitation. The communities are too remote, too poorly connected to national political centres, too far from the roads and markets that would make their land attractive to large-scale agricultural interests, at least in the interior. At the edges, where access is easier, the pressures are real and ongoing. But the deep interior has been protected, not by law enforcement or formal conservation management, but by the simple practical fact that it is very hard to get to and very hard to stay in. The 52 artefacts in the stone cache at T1 are still there, as far as anyone knows. They were documented, photographed, and left in place in 2015. The Honduran Institute of Anthropology and History, which has jurisdiction over such finds, made the decision not to remove them. Partly this was logistical. Getting them out would have required helicopter transport and careful packing, and the priority was documentation rather than extraction. But partly it reflects a broader principle. The site is better protected by being hard to reach than it would be by being excavated and moved to a facility that might itself face security challenges. The forest is a better vault than most museums, for the specific reason that no one can easily get to it. There is something quietly remarkable about that. The artifacts that were placed in that cache, whether as an offering, a deposit, a marker of some kind, have been in the same location for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. They have been through centuries of rain and biological activity and the slow movement of forest growth. They have not been looted, not because they were guarded, but because the forest around them was impenetrable enough that no one knew they were there. And now that people do know they are there, the forest is still the most effective protection they have. The biodiversity of La Mosquitia and the archaeology of La Mosquitia are, in this sense, in the same position. Both are intact. Both are known to exist, in rough outline, through remote sensing and limited ground surveys. Both are inaccessible enough that sustained study is not currently practical, and both are under pressure from the edges, from the gradual encroachment of activities that are moving inward as the buffer zones erode and the practical barriers to access slowly decrease. The jaguar population of the Rio Platano Reserve is not counted precisely, because counting jaguars in dense rainforest is extremely difficult. Camera trap surveys have documented their presence. Tracks and sign have been recorded by researchers and by indigenous community members who move through the forest regularly. The population is believed to be viable, meaning large enough and connected enough to be self-sustaining. But the viability depends on the integrity of the habitat, and the habitat integrity depends on the edges holding. If the cattle ranching frontier continues to advance, if the forest corridors that connect the interior to adjacent reserves are cut, the jaguar population becomes isolated. An isolated population of large predators in a fragment of forest is not a viable population. It is a population in slow decline. The same logic applies to tapirs, to peccaries, to the harpy eagle, to the dozens of other species whose presence in La Mosquitia depends on having enough intact, connected forest to sustain them. The interior is fine for now. The edges are the problem, and the edges are where the forest's natural defences, the flooding, the instability, the distance, are weakest, because the edges are where human activity has already made inroads, built roads, cleared land, created the conditions under which further encroachment becomes easier. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it is not a simple situation. The people who are clearing land at the edges of La Mosquitia are not, in most cases, acting out of malice toward jaguars or harpy eagles or pre-Columbian earthworks. They are, in many cases, poor families looking for agricultural land in a country where land distribution is deeply unequal, and where the formal land tenure system has historically excluded rural and indigenous communities from secure title. The structural pressures that push people toward the forest margins are real, and they are not going to be resolved by conservation policy alone. The tension between the need to protect the interior and the realities of land poverty and inequality in Honduras is not a tension that has an easy answer. but the fact that the answer is not easy does not change what is at stake. The Rio Platano Biosphere Reserve and the broader La Mosquitia region around it represent something that is genuinely rare in the 21st century. A large, intact, functioning tropical ecosystem with a full complement of large mammals, birds, and plant communities in a region that has not been significantly altered by industrial-scale human activity. Places like this are not common. They are becoming less common. And once the interior integrity of a place like this is broken, once the corridors are cut and the jaguar populations are isolated and the forest cover is fragmented beyond the threshold where the ecosystem can sustain itself, it does not come back on any timescale that is meaningful to human beings. The inaccessibility of La Mosquitia has been, for centuries, the region's defining characteristic. It has shaped the history of the Mosquito Kingdom and the failure of Spanish colonization. It has preserved the earthworks of pre-Columbian societies that would otherwise have been destroyed. It has maintained the biological richness of one of the most species-dense ecosystems in the Western Hemisphere. It has done all of this not through any plan or policy or human decision, but simply by being what it is: wet, dense, unstable, remote, and deeply indifferent to the needs and intentions of anyone trying to move through it. The threats that are now pressing in from the edges are real, and they are not going away. The narco-trafficking routes that have carved airstrips into the jungle margins, the cattle ranching frontier, the agricultural colonization pressure, these are not abstract risks. They are documented, ongoing, and in some respects accelerating. And they bring with them a dimension of danger that is entirely different from the biological hazards of the forest itself, a dimension that has made the region significantly more complicated for researchers, for conservationists, and for the indigenous communities who live within it. That last point is worth staying with for a moment, because it changes the character of the region in a way that is easy to underestimate. The natural environment of La Mosquitia has always been dangerous. The Fer-de-Lance, the flooding rivers, the leishmaniasis, the sheer physical difficulty of moving through triple canopy forest in near constant rain. These are real hazards, and they have shaped every expedition that has ever attempted to enter the interior. But they are, in a certain sense, neutral. The forest does not have intentions. A fer-de-lance will strike if it is threatened or surprised, not because it has decided to oppose your presence. A river will flood because the rainfall upstream has reached a threshold, not because it is trying to stop you specifically. The biological dangers of La Mosquitia are formidable, but they are impersonal. The danger introduced by narco-trafficking is not impersonal. It involves people who have specific interests in keeping outsiders out, who have the means to enforce that preference, and who operate in a region where the Honduran state has very limited capacity to monitor or respond to what happens on the ground. The presence of drug trafficking routes in La Mosquitia is not a recent development, and it is not a rumour. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, along with US government agencies including the DEA, have documented for decades that the eastern lowlands of Honduras function as a transit corridor for cocaine moving northward from South America. The geography that makes La Mosquitia impenetrable to legitimate expeditions makes it, from a different perspective, extremely useful. There are no road checkpoints because there are no roads. There is no regular law enforcement presence because the terrain makes regular presence logistically impossible. The same river systems that indigenous communities have used for centuries as transport routes can move goods without detection. And the forest canopy that defeated Spanish colonizers and frustrated 20th century explorers also defeats aerial surveillance, at least partially. The region is not just remote from the perspective of researchers, it is remote from the perspective of the Honduran government, which has struggled for decades to establish meaningful administrative presence in the Department of Gracias a Dios, where much of La Mosquitia lies. The scale of the infrastructure that has been built into the jungle margins is, when you look at the documentation, genuinely striking. Satellite imagery analysed by researchers and journalists over the years has identified dozens of clandestine airstrips carved into the forest, some of them long enough to accommodate small cargo planes. These are not improvised clearings. They represent significant labour and planning, and they require ongoing maintenance to remain usable. Some are in areas that are nominally within the boundaries of protected reserves. The forest grows back quickly in this climate. An unused airstrip can be reclaimed by vegetation within a few years, so the fact that many of these strips appear maintained in imagery suggests active, ongoing use. The logistics of running a drug transit corridor through terrain. This difficult are considerable, which means the organisations doing it have both the resources and the local knowledge to operate effectively in an environment that defeats most outside actors. For researchers and journalists who have tried to enter the region, this layer of human presence has introduced a kind of risk that is qualitatively different from anything in the natural environment. There are documented accounts from the 2010s of people entering the margins of La Mosquitia and being approached, warned or turned back by armed individuals who were not affiliated with any government agency. In some cases, these encounters were relatively low-key. A warning delivered through an intermediary, a sense of being watched, a message passed through a community contact that certain areas were not safe to enter. In other cases, they were more direct. Journalists working on stories about the region have described being told explicitly by people who are clearly armed and clearly not interested in negotiation that they should leave. The specifics vary, but the pattern is consistent. The interior of La Mosquitia, particularly the river corridors that would be the most useful transit routes, is not unoccupied territory. It is territory that certain people have an interest in controlling, and they have the means to make that interest felt. The incident that brought the most international attention to this dimension of the region happened in May 2012, near the small Mosquito community of Ahuas, which sits along the Patuca River in the heart of La Mosquitia. A joint operation involving the DEA and Honduran security forces intercepted what they believed to be a drug shipment travelling by boat along the river. In the course of the operation, 4 civilians were killed. The victims included 2 pregnant women and a man who were travelling on a boat that was, according to witness accounts and subsequent investigations, carrying passengers rather than drugs. The incident was investigated by the Honduran government, by human rights organisations, and by the US Congress. It became a significant controversy in the United States, partly because the DEA's role in the operation raised questions about the legal framework governing US law enforcement activities in Honduras, and partly because the civilian deaths were documented clearly enough that they could not be easily dismissed. What the Ahuas incident illustrated, beyond the specific tragedy of the people who died, was the complexity of operating in a region where the state has limited presence and where the boundaries between different kinds of activity, community transportation, fishing, trade and drug transit, are not always clearly delineated on the ground. The Mosquito communities along the Patuca and the Rio Coco have their own relationships with the river systems, their own patterns of movement and commerce, and their own understandings of territorial boundaries that do not map neatly onto the categories used by outside law enforcement agencies. The river is a highway in the most literal sense for these communities. It is how people travel between villages, how goods move, how families maintain contact across distances that would be completely impassable by land. When a law enforcement operation treats river traffic as presumptively suspicious, the consequences for the communities who depend on the river for ordinary life can be severe. The Mosquito communities of the region have, in the years since 2012, reported ongoing violence and intimidation that they attribute to drug trafficking organisations operating in the area. There have been documented killings of community members, disputes over land and river access, and accounts of armed groups establishing informal control over certain river stretches. Human rights organisations working in Honduras have documented these reports and raised them with the Honduran government and with international bodies. The response has been limited, partly because the government's capacity to operate in the region is genuinely constrained by the same logistical factors that limit everyone else, and partly because the political will to prioritise a remote and sparsely populated region has not always been present. For conservation work, the implications are significant. The Rio Platano Biosphere Reserve has rangers, a small number of them, working in an area of more than 8,000 square kilometres with minimal resources and limited backup. The job of a park ranger in this context is not the same as the job of a park ranger in a well-resourced protected area with road access and reliable communication. It involves operating in terrain where extraction takes days, where communication is intermittent, and where the people you might need to confront over illegal activity may be armed in ways that make confrontation genuinely dangerous. Several rangers working in protected areas in Honduras have been killed in the past 2 decades. The work is not abstract. The risk is not theoretical. What this means for the archaeology is that the sites identified by LIDAR, the earthwork complexes, the plazas, the mounds, sit in a region where the practical security environment makes sustained ground-level study extremely difficult to organise. An archaeological expedition requires weeks on the ground, a team of specialists, logistical support, and the ability to work methodically and carefully in a fixed location. All of those requirements are harder to meet in a region where the security situation is unpredictable, and where the presence of armed groups with interests in keeping outsiders away is documented. The Honduran government has been supportive of archaeological work in La Mosquitia in principle. The T1 site and the broader LIDAR findings have been matters of national interest and some national pride, but translating that support into the kind of sustained, multi-season fieldwork that would be needed to properly understand what the LIDAR data shows has proven difficult. Security assessments have to be conducted. Coordination with military or police escorts adds complexity and cost. The logistics of getting a team in, keeping them supplied, and getting them out safely become significantly more involved when the human environment is as unpredictable as the natural one. There is also a subtler effect, which is harder to quantify but worth noting. The presence of trafficking activity in the region has contributed to a general atmosphere of uncertainty around access that affects not just formal expeditions, but also the informal networks of knowledge and guidance that researchers depend on. Local guides, community members with knowledge of the interior, individuals who might serve as intermediaries between outside researchers and the landscape. These people have their own risk calculations to make. Helping a foreign research team enter the interior is not a neutral act in a region where armed groups are watching who moves through and why. The knowledge that exists within indigenous communities about the region's interior, the routes, the conditions, the locations of features that have never been formally documented, is knowledge that is not freely available, not because people are unwilling to share it in principle, but because the practical context in which sharing it might happen has become considerably more complicated. None of this is to say that the region is uniformly controlled by criminal organisations, or that every attempt to enter La Mosquitia will be met with armed resistance. That would be an overstatement. The region is large, and the activity within it is patchy and variable. There are river stretches and forest areas that remain, as far as anyone can tell, genuinely outside the influence of trafficking routes. The indigenous communities that live in the region continue to live in it, to move through it, to maintain their relationships with the landscape. Life continues, the forest continues, but the layer of human danger that has been added to the natural obstacles of La Mosquitia over the past few decades is real, and it has materially changed the risk profile of entering the region for anyone who is not already part of the communities that belong there. What is perhaps most striking about this dimension of the story is the way it compounds the other barriers rather than simply adding to them. The natural environment of La Mosquitia was already a formidable obstacle. The logistical challenges of supplying and extracting a team were already close to the limit of what is practically manageable. The biological hazards were already serious enough to require significant medical preparation and post-expedition treatment. And now, layered over all of that, There is the additional complexity of a human security environment that is unpredictable, that cannot be mapped or planned around with the same tools you use to plan around a river crossing or a snake bite, and that has the potential to turn a difficult expedition into a dangerous one in ways that have nothing to do with the forest itself. The region, in this sense, has acquired a new kind of impermeability. It was always hard to enter. It is now hard to enter for reasons that overlap and reinforce each other in ways that no single solution can address. Better equipment does not solve the security problem. Better security coordination does not solve the flooding. Better medical preparation does not solve the supply chain. Every layer of difficulty is real, and they all exist simultaneously in the same stretch of forest, along the same river corridors, in the same rainy season that has been making this place essentially uncrossable for as long as people have been trying to cross it. Which brings up a question that is in some ways the most practical one of all. Given everything, the terrain, the biology, the logistics, the security, the sheer physical resistance of the place, who is actually in La Mosquitia right now, and what do they know that the rest of us do not? The honest answer to that question is that the picture is incomplete, and in some ways deliberately so. What researchers know about La Mosquitia as of the early 2020s is a strange combination of high-resolution aerial data and almost total ground-level uncertainty. The LIDAR surveys gave scientists something remarkable: a detailed map of shapes beneath the canopy, earthworks and plazas and mound complexes rendered in precise three-dimensional point clouds. But shapes are not the same as knowledge. A shape tells you something is there. It does not tell you what it is made of, how old it is, what culture built it, what condition it is in, or what might be living in and around it right now. The gap between what the aerial data shows and what can actually be confirmed by someone standing on the ground remains, as of this writing, very wide. Follow-up ground expeditions to the T1 site after the initial 2015 visit have been extremely limited. A 2016 survey did take place, and some additional fieldwork was conducted, but the details of what was found and documented in that work have not been fully published or publicly disclosed. This is not unusual in archaeology. Field reports take time, institutional processes are slow, and there are often good reasons to restrict information about the location of sensitive sites before proper protections are in place. But it does mean that the public picture of what is actually known about T1 is still largely based on what was reported from that first 9-day visit in February 2015. A stone cache, 52 artifacts, a central plaza, pyramidal mounds, and a team of researchers who came home with parasitic infections and the strong sense that they had barely scratched the surface of what the site contained. Chris Fisher, the archaeologist from Colorado State University who led the ground truthing work, has continued his analysis using remote data. He has been careful and measured in his public statements, which is worth noting. He has not claimed that T1 is the legendary Ciudad Blanca. He has not described it as the greatest lost city in the Americas. What he has said, consistently, is that the LIDAR data reveals a landscape that was heavily modified by human activity over a long period of time, that the scale of the earthwork suggests a complex and organised society, and that the site deserves sustained, methodical archaeological study. That study has not yet happened at the scale it would require. Part of the reason for that is everything discussed already: the terrain, the security environment, the logistics. But part of it is also something more structural. Archaeological fieldwork in a region this remote requires not just a team and equipment, but a multi-season commitment. You cannot understand a site like T1 in 9 days, or even in a few weeks. Properly excavating and documenting a pre-Columbian urban complex takes years of work, ideally with a base camp that can be resupplied, a stable security situation, and the kind of institutional support that sustains long-term projects. None of those conditions currently exist in La Mosquitia in a reliable way. The site was found, in a sense, before the infrastructure to study it properly was in place, and building that infrastructure in this particular landscape is not a straightforward problem. What has continued in the meantime is aerial work. Additional LIDAR surveys have been conducted over other parts of the region, and the data from those surveys has been quietly significant. Some researchers working with the imagery have identified what appear to be other earthwork complexes elsewhere in the Mosquitia interior, not just T1, but potentially dozens of sites distributed across the landscape, connected by what may have been a network of roads or causeways that are now invisible at ground level, but detectable from the air as subtle linear features in the terrain. The number of these potential sites is not publicly confirmed, and the research is still in early stages, but the emerging picture is not of a single isolated lost city, but of something considerably more distributed. A landscape that was, at some point in the past, substantially inhabited and organised across a wide area. This changes the question somewhat. The popular framing of La Mosquitia as the hiding place of one great lost city, Ciudad Blanca, the White City, the place of the monkey god, may be in a sense both an understatement and a misunderstanding. If the LiDAR data is pointing toward a network of sites rather than a single spectacular centre, then the archaeological significance of the region is not a single discovery waiting to be made. It is a whole chapter of pre-Columbian history that is essentially unread, spread across a landscape that is actively resistant to the kind of sustained human presence that reading it would require. That is a different kind of problem than finding a lost city. It is, in some ways, a harder one. The Honduran government has, at various points, expressed interest in developing La Mosquitia in ways that would make it more accessible, not necessarily for large-scale tourism, but for ecotourism, for controlled access, for the kind of regulated visitation that has worked in other protected areas in Central America. The idea has a certain logic to it. The region is extraordinary. The biodiversity alone would draw serious naturalists and wildlife photographers. The archaeological sites, if properly managed, could be a significant cultural attraction. There is real economic potential in a landscape that currently generates almost nothing in formal terms for the Honduran economy. But the infrastructure required to support even modest ecotourism does not exist. There are no roads into the interior. The airstrips that exist are small, unpaved and weather-dependent. There are no lodges, no reliable communication networks, no medical facilities within reach. Building that infrastructure would require significant investment, and more importantly, it would require making decisions about access that are currently unresolved. Who gets to enter the region and under what conditions? Who manages the sites? Who benefits from the revenue? These are not simple questions, and they are not purely logistical ones. The indigenous communities who live in and around La Mosquitia have a direct stake in how those questions are answered, and their voices have not always been central to the conversations that outside governments, researchers, and development organisations have been having about the region. The Mosquito, the Pech, the Tawaka. These communities have territorial rights that are recognised under Honduran law and under international frameworks including ILO Convention 169, which Honduras has ratified. Any development of the region, any research programme, any access arrangement that does not involve meaningful consultation with and consent from these communities is not just ethically problematic. It is legally questionable and practically likely to fail, because the communities that know the region best are also the ones whose cooperation any serious long-term project would depend on. There have been tensions around this. The 2015 expedition, despite its scientific significance, drew some criticism from indigenous rights advocates who felt that the Honduran government had not adequately consulted with local communities before authorising access to areas that overlapped with indigenous territories. The archaeologists involved were generally respectful of local concerns and worked within the frameworks that were available to them, but the broader process of deciding who has access to La Mosquitia and on whose terms remains unresolved and at times contested. What this means in practice is that the region sits in a kind of institutional limbo. It is known to contain significant archaeological sites. It is known to be one of the most biodiverse and ecologically intact areas in the Western Hemisphere. it is known to be under pressure from encroachment at its edges, and yet the combination of physical difficulty, security concerns, unresolved questions about indigenous land rights, and the sheer logistical complexity of working there means that the sustained, coordinated effort that would be needed to properly protect and study it has not materialized. Various institutions have expressed interest, various proposals have been made, but the gap between expressed interest and actual capacity to act in this particular landscape is, like so many other gaps in La Mosquitia, very large. There is also a practical question about what ground-level access to the interior sites would actually look like, even if all the other problems were resolved. The T1 site and the other potential earthwork complexes identified by LIDAR are not located near the edges of the region where some limited infrastructure exists. They are in the interior, which means that reaching them requires either helicopter transport, expensive, weather-dependent and limited in what it can carry, or an overland journey of the kind that has defeated most attempts to make it. A helicopter can get a small team to a clearing near a site, but it cannot resupply them reliably, and it cannot extract them quickly if the weather closes in. An overland approach would require the kind of multi-week expedition that the terrain and security environment make extremely difficult to organise safely. There is no easy option. Every route in has a serious problem attached to it. The result is a situation that is, in scientific terms, genuinely frustrating. The LIDAR data is sitting there, detailed and precise, showing features that could rewrite the understanding of pre-Columbian civilization in Central America. The sites are there, under the canopy, presumably in various states of preservation. The questions that could be answered by a proper multi-season excavation are real and important questions about who built these structures, when, what culture they belonged to, how they related to other known civilizations in the region, why they were abandoned, what the population density of the interior was at its peak. These are not trivial questions. They are the kind of questions that, if answered, would add something genuinely new to the historical record, and they cannot currently be answered because the place where the answers are located is effectively inaccessible for sustained scientific work. That double state, known and unknown at the same time, is one of the stranger aspects of La Mosquitia in the current moment. Before LIDAR, the uncertainty was complete. Researchers suspected that something significant might be in the interior, but they had no direct evidence of it. The aerial surveys changed that. They produced evidence. They confirmed that the interior contained human-made structures of real complexity and scale. But in doing so, they created a new kind of frustration, because the evidence is detailed enough to be compelling and not detailed enough to be conclusive. You can see the shape of a plaza from the air. You cannot tell from the air whether the artifacts buried in it are ceramic or stone, whether the construction dates to the 10th century or the 14th, whether the culture that built it had connections to the Maya to the north or to the Chibchan cultures to the south. For those answers, someone has to go in. And going in, as the story of the past decade makes clear, is not something that can be done casually or cheaply or safely with the current state of access to the region. So the knowledge sits at a threshold. More is known than was known 20 years ago, significantly more in terms of the aerial picture of what the landscape contains. But the ground-level knowledge, the kind that comes from careful excavation and direct physical analysis, is still almost entirely absent. The forest holds what it holds, and the distance between the image on a LIDAR screen and the reality of the forest floor remains for now essentially uncrossed. What would it actually take to bridge that distance? What would a genuine, sustained effort to understand La Mosquitia, or even to simply traverse it, require in practical terms? The answer to that question is more specific and more demanding than most people who have looked at the LIDAR images and felt the pull of the place have probably considered. So let us think about what a crossing would actually mean. Not in the romantic sense, not as an abstract feat of endurance, but in the most practical, logistical, unromantic terms possible. What would it take to enter La Mosquitia from its western edge, move through the full interior and exit at the Caribbean coast on the other side? Because that question, when you sit with it long enough and start filling in the specific details, reveals something that the aerial images and the expedition summaries and the documentary footage do not quite convey. The difficulty is not just large, it is structural. It is built into the geometry of the place in a way that does not yield to effort or determination, or better equipment in any simple sense. The distance involved, measured in a straight line on a map, is roughly 250 kilometres from the western highland edge of the region to the Caribbean coast. 250 kilometres does not sound impossible. People walk that kind of distance on long-distance trails in a couple of weeks, but the comparison falls apart almost immediately because a long-distance trail is a managed surface designed for human movement, with predictable elevation changes, marked water sources, and the possibility of resupply. La Mosquitia's interior is none of those things. The 250 kilometres on the map do not correspond to 250 kilometres of walkable ground. The actual distance travelled through the terrain, accounting for river detours, flooded lowland bypasses, ridge traversals, and the constant requirement to find passable ground rather than direct ground, would be substantially longer. Some estimates from people who have worked in the region suggest that a true interior crossing would involve something closer to 400 kilometres of actual movement, and that is assuming no major route failures, no injuries requiring detours, and no extended weather delays. In a region where those three things are essentially guaranteed to occur in some combination, the real number is probably higher. The time requirement follows from that distance, and it is one of the factors that makes the crossing genuinely prohibitive in a way that is hard to fully appreciate from outside. A well-conditioned team moving through lowland tropical forest can cover, on a good day with manageable terrain, perhaps 8 to 12 kilometres. On a bad day, flooded ground, dense undergrowth, a river crossing that takes most of the morning, that number drops to 3 or 4 kilometres, sometimes less. In the interior of La Mosquitia, bad days are not the exception. They are the baseline expectation. The forest floor in the lowland sections is frequently underwater during the rainy season, which runs roughly from May through November, and even in the dry season the ground retains water in ways that make movement slow and physically exhausting. Researchers who have spent time in the region consistently describe the experience of walking through it not as hiking, but as something closer to wading, through mud, through root systems, through vegetation that does not part so much as resist and cling. A realistic estimate for a full crossing, given all of that, is somewhere between 30 and 45 days of active travel, possibly longer, and that creates the supply problem, which is not a minor logistical inconvenience, but a fundamental constraint that has no clean solution. A person doing sustained physical work in hot, humid conditions requires roughly 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day to maintain body weight and functional capacity. Food for one person for 40 days, at that caloric level, weighs somewhere around 20 to 25 kilograms if you are using the most calorie-dense, lightweight expedition food available. That is before you add water treatment equipment, medical supplies, shelter, communication equipment, navigation tools, or any of the other gear that a team in a remote, medically hostile environment would need to carry. A realistic pack weight for a single team member on an expedition of this length, in this environment, starts at around 30 kilograms and goes up from there depending on their specific role. That weight in that heat and humidity, over that terrain, is not just uncomfortable. It is a physical problem that compounds every other physical problem the environment presents. And there is no resupply. That is the part that is easy to say and hard to fully absorb. In most remote wilderness environments, a long expedition can be supported by periodic airdrops or pre-positioned caches. La Mosquitia does not reliably allow for either. The canopy is too dense for accurate airdrops in most of the interior. The few clearings that exist are not predictably located along any rational crossing route, and their usability depends on weather conditions that cannot be predicted more than a day or two in advance. Helicopter resupply, which is the most flexible option, requires a landing zone, which requires either a natural clearing or a cleared space, and requires weather conditions that permit flight, conditions that in the interior of La Mosquitia are frequently absent for days at a time. The practical result is that a crossing team would need to carry essentially everything they need for the entire journey from the start. There is no margin for miscalculation on food, no ability to replace equipment that fails, and no reliable mechanism for getting additional medical supplies to a team that encounters a serious illness or injury in the interior. The medical dimension of this deserves its own consideration because it is not just a background risk. It is an active, ongoing, cumulative threat that increases with every day spent in the interior. The 2015 expedition, which spent 9 days on the ground near the T1 site, 9 days, not 40, resulted in nearly the entire team contracting cutaneous leishmaniasis. That is a parasitic infection transmitted by sandflies, and in its cutaneous form it produces ulcerating skin lesions that, if untreated, can persist for months and cause significant tissue damage. The treatment involves either a course of antimonial drugs, which have significant side effects, or a newer medication called miltefosine, which is more tolerable but still requires a full treatment course and medical monitoring. In the field, in the interior of La Mosquitia, treatment is not available. The nearest facilities capable of diagnosing and treating leishmaniasis properly are in Tegucigalpa or San Pedro Sula, which are not close. Medical evacuation from the interior, even by helicopter, is not a quick process. It requires weather, it requires a landing zone, and it requires that the situation be serious enough to justify the cost and logistical complexity of the extraction. Beyond leishmaniasis, the other biological risks compound over time in ways that a short expedition can partially manage but a long crossing cannot easily avoid. Malaria is present in the region, and while prophylactic medication can reduce the risk, it does not eliminate it, and the medications themselves have side effects that affect sleep, mood, and cognitive function over extended periods. Dengue fever, which has no prophylactic medication, is transmitted by the same Aedes mosquitoes that are abundantly present in the lowland sections of the region. A dengue infection in the interior, far from medical care, with no ability to rest properly and no way to maintain adequate hydration, can become serious in a way that it would not in a clinical setting. The fer-de-lance snake, Bothrops asper, is common in exactly the kind of disturbed ground and forest edge habitat that a crossing team would be moving through constantly. Antivenom exists, but it requires refrigeration, it has a limited shelf life, and it needs to be administered properly and relatively quickly after a bite. Carrying it is possible in theory. Relying on it as a safety net in a multi-week interior crossing is a different matter. The team composition required for a serious crossing attempt reflects all of these constraints and adds a few more. The minimum viable team size that researchers and expedition planners who have thought about this seriously tend to suggest is somewhere between 8 and 12 people. Smaller than that, and you do not have enough redundancy for injury, illness, or equipment failure. Larger than that, and the logistical complexity of moving the group, feeding them, and managing their safety becomes unworkable. Within that team, you would need at minimum people with serious wilderness medicine training, ideally including a physician or paramedic, experienced guides from the Mosquito or Tawaka communities who know the river systems and the terrain patterns of the specific sections being traversed, people with competence in technical river crossing, because the major rivers of the interior, the Patuca, the Platano, the Paulaya, will need to be crossed, and during or after rain they are not crossable by wading. Communication specialists capable of maintaining satellite contact, and people with the specific physical conditioning required for sustained movement through lowland tropical terrain, which is a different kind of fitness from what most outdoor athletes train for. The guide question is not just practical, it is also, as discussed in the context of the current access situation, a matter of relationships and permissions that take time to build and cannot be assumed. The Mosquito and Tuaca communities whose territories overlap with any realistic crossing route have their own interests, their own governance structures, and their own reasons to be cautious about outside groups moving through their lands. A crossing team that attempted to enter without genuine community engagement and consent would not only be acting unethically, it would also be practically at a disadvantage, because the local knowledge held by community members is not a nice-to-have supplement to the team's own navigation capacity, it is essential. The rivers shift. The ground conditions change seasonally in ways that are not captured in any map. The knowledge of which routes are passable and which are not at a given time of year, which river sections can be navigated by raft and which cannot, where safe camping ground exists and where it does not. That knowledge lives in the communities, not in any database or LIDAR dataset. There have been attempts, or near attempts, that illustrate how these constraints play out in practice. In the late 1990s, a small team of adventurers with significant jungle experience attempted to enter the interior from the western side, following a river valley that appeared on maps to offer a viable route toward the interior. They made it perhaps 40 kilometers before a combination of flooding and a team member's foot infection forced them to turn back. The foot infection, which began as a small cut, had become seriously inflamed within 4 days due to the constant wet conditions and the near impossibility of keeping any wound clean in that environment. They extracted by following the river back to a point where radio contact was possible and arranged for a boat pickup. The attempt was well organised by the standards of adventure expeditions. It lasted less than 2 weeks and covered less than a fifth of the distance a full crossing would require. In 2006, a Honduran military unit tasked with a survey operation in the interior attempted an east to west traverse of a section of the region. They had military logistics support, they were physically conditioned, and they had radio communication throughout. They covered roughly 60 kilometers over 18 days before being extracted due to a combination of supply problems and a river crossing that proved impassable after unexpected rainfall raised the water level overnight. 60 kilometers in 18 days with military support and training in a section of the region that was not even the most difficult part of the interior. The arithmetic of a full crossing, applied to those numbers, does not produce an encouraging result. What these attempts share is not a failure of will or preparation. The people involved were serious, capable, and reasonably well equipped. What they encountered was the specific way that La Mosquitia accumulates problems. Each individual obstacle, the flooded ground, the river crossing, the infection, the supply shortfall, is manageable in isolation. The forest does not present one large, dramatic barrier that a determined team can identify and overcome. It presents a continuous series of medium-sized problems that arrive faster than they can be resolved, and that compound each other in ways that are difficult to anticipate from outside. The flooded ground slows progress, which extends the time required, which increases food consumption, which reduces the margin for further delays, which means that the next obstacle, the one that would have been manageable with a week of buffer time, is now critical. This is the pattern that has ended every serious attempt to penetrate the full interior of La Mosquitia in the modern era. Not a single catastrophic failure, but a slow accumulation of costs that eventually exceeds the team's capacity to absorb them. The margin for error, as the outline of this problem makes clear, is essentially zero. A crossing that goes exactly as planned, with no significant injuries, no extended weather delays, no equipment failures, and no route problems, is probably achievable in theory by a very well-prepared team. But a crossing that goes exactly as planned is not how La Mosquitia works. The region does not make allowances for plans. It presents conditions, and the conditions are what they are, and the team adapts or it does not. The history of attempts suggests that the conditions reliably exceed the adaptation capacity of even well-prepared teams before a full crossing can be completed. That is not a statement about human inadequacy. It is a statement about what the terrain actually is. There is also a question that does not get asked often enough in the context of crossing attempts. which is, what would a crossing achieve that other methods of study cannot? The LiDAR surveys have already produced more spatial information about the interior than any ground traverse could generate. Targeted helicopter insertions to specific sites, while logistically difficult, are more efficient for archaeological purposes than a linear crossing. The indigenous communities who live within the region's logic have knowledge that a crossing team passing through could not acquire in any meaningful way. The crossing, as a concept, has a certain narrative power. The idea of moving through the full extent of an unknown place, from one side to the other, as a form of comprehension. But it's not clear that the comprehension gained from a crossing would be proportionate to the cost and risk involved. The forest resists not just physically, but conceptually. It does not yield its meaning to people moving through it quickly, under pressure, focused on survival. Understanding La Mosquitia, in any deep sense, probably requires something slower and more embedded than a traverse, and yet the idea of the crossing persists. It draws people in the way that the legend of the Ciudad Blanca drew people in, not entirely because of what might be found, but because of what the attempt itself represents. The last genuinely uncrossable place in the Western Hemisphere, the forest that has defeated everyone who has tried to move through it on its own terms. There is something about that which is hard to let go of, even when you understand the specific, practical, unglamorous reasons why the crossing has not been done. The pull is real. It is just that the forest is realer. And as the people who have come closest to the interior and returned from it tend to say, in one way or another, the forest is not waiting to be crossed. It is simply there, doing what it does, indifferent to the question. The question belongs to the people standing at its edge, looking in, and the region keeps drawing them, keeps drawing researchers and journalists and adventurers and archaeologists, not because it promises answers, but because it holds them just out of reach. Visible enough on a LiDAR screen to be tantalizing, inaccessible enough on the ground to remain, for now, essentially beyond the reach of anyone who has tried. There is something worth sitting with for a moment, before we try to draw any meaning from all of this. We live in an era when the surface of Mars has been mapped in higher resolution than parts of the Earth's ocean floor. When a person standing on a street corner in a city they have never visited can look at a satellite image of that exact corner, taken within the last few months, and orient themselves before they have even stepped outside, when the idea of a truly unknown place feels like it belongs to a different century, a different kind of world, and yet here is La Mosquitia. 83,000 square kilometers of eastern Honduras and northeastern Nicaragua. A place that has been known about, in the broadest sense, since the 16th century. A place that has been photographed from the air, scanned by laser, studied by satellite. A place where the shapes of ancient plazas and pyramidal mounds are visible on a computer screen in a university office in Colorado. And still, on the ground, it is essentially uncrossed. That is not a romantic exaggeration. It is just what the record shows. What is strange about this is not that the place is difficult. Plenty of places are difficult. What is strange is that the difficulty has not diminished in proportion to the tools available to address it. The gap between what we can see and what we can actually reach has not closed, in the way that gaps like that usually close. The LiDAR data from 2012 showed earthworks with a precision that earlier explorers could not have imagined. It did not make walking to those earthworks any easier. The GPS coordinates of Site T1 are known. The helicopter flight to reach it is possible, in the right weather, with the right clearance. The 9 days that the 2015 expedition spent on the ground still ended with most of the team members carrying a parasitic infection home in their skin. The technology advanced. The forest did not adjust. There is a particular kind of humility that comes from understanding this, if you let it settle properly. Not the theatrical humility of someone saying that nature is more powerful than humans, which is true but also a bit easy to say from a distance. Something quieter than that. The specific recognition that there are places on this planet where the conditions are not hostile to human life in general, but specifically hostile to the kind of human presence that involves moving through, studying, cataloguing, and ultimately comprehending. La Mosquitia is not uninhabited. The mosquito people have lived on its rivers for centuries. The Pech have lived in its interior highlands. The Tuaca have navigated the Patuca and its tributaries for generations. These communities are not suffering under the weight of the forest. They are not conquering it. They are living within a logic that the forest itself provides, and that logic, once you understand it, makes the whole history of outside expeditions look slightly different. The explorers and researchers who have tried to enter the region from outside, the Spanish in the 16th century, the British traders in the 17th, Theodore Maud in 1940, the various survey teams of the latter 20th century, the 2015 ground expedition, all of them arrived with a particular orientation. They came to cross, to find, to document, to understand on their own terms and within their own time frames. And the forest, without malice or intention, simply did not accommodate that orientation. It is not that the forest was protecting a secret. It is that the forest operates on a timescale and a logic that does not match the project of a 2-week expedition with a supply cache and an extraction plan. The communities who lived there did not cross the forest. They became part of it, slowly, over generations, in a way that cannot be replicated by a team with a satellite phone and a 30-day food supply. This is not a mystical observation. It is a practical one. The mosquito relationship with the rivers is not metaphorical. It is a specific, accumulated body of knowledge about which channels are passable in which seasons, which bends flood first, whether sandflies are worst, what the watercolour means, when to stop and wait. That knowledge took generations to develop and cannot be downloaded or briefed in advance. The outside expeditions that have done best in the region are the ones that included indigenous guides not as a cultural formality, but as the primary navigational resource. Even then, the guide's knowledge extends to the areas their communities use, which is not the same as the full interior. There are parts of La Mosquitia that no one navigates regularly, not because they are forbidden, but because there is no practical reason to go there. No community has a use for the deepest interior. No trade route passes through it. No seasonal resource draws people into it. It is not a hidden place. It is simply a place that no one goes, because going there offers nothing that cannot be obtained more easily elsewhere. That is worth thinking about for a moment. The deepest, most inaccessible parts of La Mosquitia are not inaccessible because of what they contain. They are inaccessible because they are, in a functional sense, useless to the people who would be most capable of accessing them. The forest floor under the triple canopy, flooded for months at a time, harbouring sandflies and fer-de-lance and botfly larvae, with no dry ground to camp on and no food source that a non-specialist could reliably locate. That place has nothing to offer a traveller. The pre-Columbian settlements that the lidar revealed were built on slightly elevated ground, near reliable water sources, in locations that made agricultural and logistical sense. The people who built them were not living in the most difficult terrain. They were living in the best terrain available within the broader region. The most difficult terrain was difficult then too, and people then had the same basic reason to avoid it that people now do. The legend of the Ciudad Blanca, the great white city hidden in the deepest jungle, was always partly a projection. The idea that something magnificent must be concealed precisely in the most inaccessible place, that the difficulty of reaching it is proportionate to the grandeur of what is hidden, is a very human way of thinking. It maps onto how we tell stories about treasure and discovery and deserved reward. But the archaeology does not support that narrative. The significant pre-Columbian sites in the region are not in the deepest interior. They are in the places that were livable. The river margins, the elevated clearings, the spots where the forest thins slightly and the soil drains. T1, the site identified by the 2015 expedition, is not in the heart of the most impenetrable terrain. It is in a location that made sense to the people who built it, which means it was a location with some practical advantages. The forest around it is difficult. The site itself was chosen, in some ancient calculation, because it was relatively accessible. What this means, quietly, is that the legend was looking in the wrong direction. The cities were not in the impossible places, they were in the merely difficult ones, and the merely difficult ones have now been identified, at least in outline, by the LIDAR surveys. The truly impossible terrain, the flooded interior, the braided river systems, the ground that is underwater for half the year, probably never had large settlements, for the same reason it does not have large settlements now. It was not livable in a way that supported complex society. The forest there is not hiding something. It is just forest. And yet the conservation reality is that the forest being just forest is, at this point in history, one of the most important things it could be. The Rio Platano Biosphere Reserve, with its 2,000 plant species and 600 bird species and its jaguars and harpy eagles and giant anteaters, exists in the condition it is in because the forest's hostility has kept the edges of human encroachment from reaching the centre. The cattle ranchers and the illegal loggers and the narco-trafficking operations that have degraded the margins of the reserve have not penetrated the core. Not because of law enforcement. The Honduran government's presence in the interior is minimal at best, but because the core is genuinely, practically, economically unreachable. The cost of getting there exceeds any return that could be extracted from it. The forest's impassability is doing conservation work that no protected area designation could replicate on its own. This creates a strange situation for anyone who cares about understanding the region. The more accessible La Mosquitia becomes through better roads, more airstrips, improved logistics, the more vulnerable it becomes. The archaeological sites that have survived for 6 or 8 centuries under the canopy have survived partly because reaching them requires a helicopter and a Honduran government permit and a tolerance for leishmaniasis. Lower that barrier and the calculus changes. The artifacts that the 2015 expedition left in place per Honduran law are still there in part because getting to them is so difficult. Make it easier and they will not stay there long. This is not a hypothetical. The history of archaeological sites in more accessible parts of Central America, where looting is a serious and ongoing problem, suggests what happens when the protective difficulty is removed. So the forest's hostility is doing several things at once. It is protecting the ecology. It is protecting the archaeology. It is protecting the indigenous communities from the kind of outside pressure that easier access would bring. And it is in a way that is harder to quantify but no less real, preserving a particular kind of place, one where the human impulse to catalogue and measure and understand has not yet fully arrived. There are not many places like that left. The fact that this one exists in the 21st century in the Western Hemisphere is genuinely unusual, not magical, not mysterious in any supernatural sense, just unusual in the way that rare things are unusual and worth acknowledging as such. What we are left with, after everything, is a place that has resisted full human comprehension, not through any single dramatic quality, but through an accumulation of ordinary ones. The rain falls heavily and consistently. The rivers flood without notice. The insects carry diseases. The snakes are venomous and numerous. The ground does not support roads or airstrips or supply chains. The people who know the region best have no particular incentive to guide outsiders through its most difficult parts. The people who want to study it most urgently are the ones least equipped to survive it. None of these facts are extraordinary on their own. Together they produce a place that has, so far, remained essentially beyond reach. There will be more expeditions. There will be more LiDAR surveys, probably covering a larger area, probably revealing more earthwork complexes that researchers will then spend years trying to figure out how to study on the ground. The Honduran government will continue to express interest in ecotourism development, while the infrastructure required for it remains non-existent. The indigenous communities will continue navigating the tension, between their territorial rights and the outside world's interest in what lies within their territory, the forest will continue doing what it does, growing, flooding, reclaiming, indifferent to the question of whether anyone understands it. And somewhere in the interior, under a canopy so thick that the light on the forest floor is green and dim even at midday, the stone artifacts from T1 are still sitting where the 2015 expedition found them. Carved vessels, stone seats, a were-jaguar sculpture with its mouth open, half buried in the soil, left there because the law required it, and because moving them would have required a level of logistical support that the expedition did not have, and because the forest around them made the whole question of removal feel slightly academic. They have been there for somewhere between 600 and 1,000 years. They will probably still be there for a while longer. The forest, as it turns out, is reasonably good at keeping things. If you have made it to the end of this, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of topic that rewards slow attention, and the fact that you stayed with it all the way through means something. If La Mosquitia is a place that stayed with you, the geography of it, the archaeology, the conservation tension, the strange double state of being both mapped and unreachable, leave a comment below. I am always curious what draws people to particular places or questions, and this one has a way of getting under your skin. If you enjoyed this narration, a like helps more than you might think, and subscribing means you will be here for the next one. Rest well, wherever you are tonight.